Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. This also keeps you updated with new episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was out late with my dog, Max. It was around 11 p.m., and the street was quiet, just how I liked it for our walks. There's something calming about the stillness at night, with the streetlights casting long shadows. We'd been walking for a few minutes, and Max was sniffing around as usual. I had my hoodie up because it was a bit chilly, and I didn't expect to see anyone out. We were about halfway down the block when I noticed a car driving slowly toward us. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe someone looking for a house or a parking spot. The car, an old sedan, passed us, the driver barely visible in the shadows behind the windshield. I didn't look too hard, just gave it a quick glance and kept walking. But then, maybe 5 minutes later, I heard the sound of an engine behind me again. I turned slightly and saw the same car creeping up behind us. This time it slowed even more as it passed. I couldn't see the driver's face, but it felt like they were watching me. A small, uneasy feeling crept up, but I shook it off. Maybe it was a coincidence, just someone lost or making loops around the neighborhood. Max didn't seem to notice, so we kept walking. I took a turn down another street, thinking I'd head back toward my house. But just as I rounded the corner, I heard the car again. My heart sank when I saw it turn the corner, following me. This time, it drove even slower, almost crawling alongside us. I felt exposed, like I was being hunted. I tugged on Max's leash, trying to act normal, but my pulse was racing. The car passed us once more and disappeared down the road. I thought about turning back home, but I didn't want them to see where I lived. My mind raced, wondering if I was overreacting or if something was really wrong. I decided to keep walking, making a wide circle around the block to buy time and see if the car would reappear. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see the car again. A few minutes went by, and I didn't hear anything. I was starting to calm down, thinking maybe it was just my imagination getting the best of me. Max was still sniffing around, completely unaware of my growing anxiety. Then, I heard it again. The low rumble of the engine, distant at first, then getting closer. My stomach turned. I didn't need to look to know it was the same car. This time, I didn't want to wait and see what they would do. I crossed the street quickly and turned down a different block, picking up the pace. Max looked up at me, sensing my tension, and began to trot alongside me. I kept looking back, and sure enough, the car turned again to follow. It wasn't subtle anymore. They were keeping their distance, but not enough to make it seem like anything other than deliberate. My breath caught in my throat. I knew I had to get off the street, but there was no one around, no open stores, no one to ask for help. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking as I tried to think of what to do. I didn't want to stop and call someone, but I also didn't want to lead this person back to my house. I turned another corner, hoping to lose them, but when I peeked over my shoulder, the car had turned too. They were following me, no doubt about it now. I decided to cut through a small park nearby, thinking the narrow paths might make it harder for the car to follow me directly. Max hesitated but followed as I pulled him into the park. The car slowed near the entrance, and I saw it stop at the curb. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I ducked behind a row of trees, crouching low and trying to quiet my breathing. I listened for the sound of a car door opening, for footsteps. But all I heard was the distant hum of the engine, still idling. After what felt like forever, I peeked around the tree and saw the car still sitting there, engine running. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see inside. I didn't move, just stood there watching, frozen in place. Max was quiet, sensing something was wrong now. I tried to steady my breathing, praying that whoever it was would just leave. After a few minutes, the car pulled away, driving off down the street. I waited, staying completely still, not trusting that they were gone for good. I counted the seconds in my head, not daring to move. Finally, when I felt it was safe, I stood up and started walking quickly in the opposite direction, sticking to the park path that would lead me to a more crowded area. I was almost out of the park when I heard footsteps behind me. My blood went cold. I turned slowly, and there, at the entrance of the park, was a figure. I couldn't make out who it was, but they were standing there, motionless, just staring at me. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to keep walking, refusing to run. Running would show fear, and I didn't want to show fear. Max started growling, low and deep, as we got closer to the street. I didn't look back again, just focused on getting out of the park and into the light. Finally, I reached the main road, where there were a few people still out and cars driving by. I breathed a sigh of relief and hurried across the street, putting as much distance as I could between me and the park. When I got home, I locked the door behind me and double-checked all the windows. My hands were still shaking, and I couldn't stop thinking about that car, that figure watching me in the dark. I was driving home late, around midnight, from a friend's place a few hours away. The roads were pretty empty, and I wasn't too familiar with the area, so I had my GPS on, guiding me. After a while, I realized I had missed a turn somewhere. The GPS was trying to reroute, but I couldn't make sense of it while driving. I figured I should pull over and check it properly before I ended up even more lost. I found a spot under an overpass, not too far off the road, and parked my car. It was quiet, no streetlights, just my headlights cutting through the darkness. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through the GPS, trying to figure out the quickest way back on track. While I was focused on the screen, I didn't notice the truck pull up behind me at first. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the headlights. A big, beat-up truck, one of those older models. I didn't think much of it until two men got out. I could see their shadows moving in the headlights. My stomach tightened a little, but I told myself they were probably just in the same situation as me, needing to check directions or something. Still, I kept an eye on them through the mirror. One of the guys approached my window, and the other stayed back near their truck. The guy who walked up looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. He knocked on my window, and I cracked it open just a little. "Hey man," he said, his voice a bit too casual, "we're kinda lost. Think you could help us out?" Something about the way he said it didn't sit right with me. His eyes darted around, not really looking at me, and his smile felt forced. The guy by the truck was leaning against it, watching us. I could feel my heart start to pick up speed. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but everything about this felt off. I forced a smile and told him I wasn't from the area, just passing through, and didn't really know the roads. He glanced back at his friend and then looked at my car, eyeing it up in a way that made my skin crawl. "Nice car," he said, leaning in closer. "What year is it?" I mumbled something about it being a few years old, trying to play it cool, but my hand was already creeping toward the door lock. He was still too close, and I didn't want to make any sudden moves. The other guy, the one by the truck, started walking over, and that's when the real panic set in. The second guy didn't say anything, just stood by the passenger side of my car, looking in through the window. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady, but inside, I was screaming at myself to get out of there. I told the guy at my window that I needed to get going, pretending to check my phone again, but he didn't move. Instead, he leaned even closer, his face practically pressed against the glass now. "Come on, just real quick. We won't take much of your time." I shook my head, saying I really couldn't help, but before I could roll the window up, he stuck his hand through the gap, grabbing the edge of the glass. That's when I knew. This wasn't about directions. I slammed the lock down on the door and rolled the window up as fast as I could. His hand slipped out just in time, but he didn't back away. His smile was gone now, replaced with a cold stare. The other guy, the quiet one, banged on the passenger window, making Max jump in the back seat. I could feel the adrenaline kicking in, my hands shaking as I fumbled to put the car in reverse. The guy at my window slammed his fist against the glass, shouting something I couldn't make out. I didn't wait to hear it. I slammed my foot on the gas and backed up hard, jerking the car toward the road. I could hear them yelling, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. The truck's headlights flashed behind me as they scrambled back to their vehicle. I didn't wait to see if they were following me. I floored it, my car tearing down the road faster than it probably should have been going. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but I didn't see them. I didn't slow down for miles, just kept driving, trying to put as much distance between me and that overpass as possible. Eventually, I saw lights ahead and realized I was coming up on a small town. I pulled into a gas station and parked by the pumps, breathing hard, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white. I sat there for a while, just trying to calm down, looking around to make sure the truck wasn't anywhere in sight. It was quiet again, and the gas station was empty, just the hum of the neon lights overhead. I got out of the car, legs shaky, and went inside to buy something to drink, mostly to get myself together. The guy behind the counter gave me a weird look, probably wondering why I looked so rattled, but I didn't say anything. I just grabbed a bottle of water and paid. My hands were still trembling as I handed him the cash. I didn't stay there long, just enough to catch my breath. When I got back in my car, I sat for a moment, staring at the empty highway ahead. I didn't know if those guys were still out there, somewhere in the dark, looking for someone else to mess with. I didn't care. I wasn't stopping again until I got home. The drive after that was a blur. Every pair of headlights in my mirror made my stomach twist, thinking it was them, but they never showed up again. I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't locked my doors, if I hadn't driven off when I did. But I don't like to think about it too much. I've never stopped on the side of the road since. It was supposed to be a fun night out. We'd gone to this bar downtown, one of those places where you have to yell over the music just to talk. There were 5 of us, all crammed into a booth, laughing, ordering rounds, having a good time. I hadn't been out in a while, so I was letting myself relax, enjoy the night. Around midnight, I got up to go to the bathroom. The line was long, and by the time I came out, I couldn't find my friends right away. The place was packed, and I thought maybe they'd gone outside to get some air. I wasn't worried, though, just figured I'd head toward the exit and meet them there. When I stepped outside, the cool air hit me, and it was like everything got quieter, the noise from inside muffled behind the heavy door. I looked around for my friends, but I didn't see them. I pulled out my phone to text them, but there was no response. I tried calling, but nothing. It wasn't unusual for service to be spotty downtown, so I just shrugged and figured I'd wait for them to come out. That's when a guy approached me. I didn't see him coming at first, just heard his voice next to me. He asked if I was okay, said he'd noticed I looked a bit lost. I glanced over, and he looked normal enough, wearing a jacket, jeans, clean cut. His smile seemed friendly, and he didn't seem drunk, just concerned. I told him I was fine, just looking for my friends. He offered to help, said he'd seen a group of girls heading toward the parking lot a few minutes ago. I thanked him but told him I'd be alright, that they'd probably be back soon. But he insisted, saying it wasn't safe to stand outside alone at this time of night, that he could walk me to my car. I hesitated, but something about his tone felt sincere, not pushy, so I agreed. We started walking, and he made small talk, asking me where I was parked. I told him it wasn't far, just a few blocks away. He nodded, but after a few minutes, I realized we weren't heading in the right direction. I knew the streets pretty well, and we were definitely walking away from where my car was. I pointed this out, thinking maybe he'd just gotten turned around, but he didn't seem bothered. "It's just a shortcut," he said, smiling again, but it didn't feel as friendly this time. I know these streets better than most. That's when I started feeling uneasy. The way he said it, like he was trying to reassure me but not really caring if it worked. I slowed down a bit, trying to get my bearings. I glanced back toward the bar, but we'd already gone too far to see it, the streetlights dimming as we moved deeper into the quiet part of town. I told him I wasn't comfortable with this and that I was going to head back, but he stopped walking and turned to face me. His expression had changed, the friendliness completely gone now. He wasn't smiling anymore. His eyes looked darker, more focused, and I could feel the tension rise between us. "You're not going anywhere," he said, his voice low. "Not yet." My heart started racing. I knew I had to get away from him, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I forced a laugh, tried to act like I wasn't scared, told him I just remembered where my car was and that I didn't need his help anymore. But he stepped closer, blocking my path. I glanced around, but the street was empty. No one was nearby, and the shops we passed were all closed. I could hear my pulse in my ears, the panic setting in, but I knew I had to stay calm. I told him I needed to get back to my friends, tried to step around him, but he grabbed my arm. The moment his hand touched me, something snapped inside. I yanked my arm away, hard, and took off running. I didn't look back, didn't care if he was following or not. I just ran as fast as I could, my shoes slapping against the pavement, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I kept running until I saw the bar again, the lights and people outside suddenly feeling like a lifeline. I stumbled back toward the door, pushing through the crowd, my hands shaking. I finally saw my friends near the entrance, laughing, completely unaware of what had just happened. I rushed up to them, trying to catch my breath, and they immediately saw the look on my face. They asked what was wrong, but I couldn't even get the words out at first. All I could think about was how close I'd come to whatever that guy had planned. Once I calmed down, I told them everything. They were shocked, but none of us really knew what to do. I didn't want to call the police. I didn't even know his name, didn't have any proof of anything. We decided to leave, all of us walking together to my car this time. The whole way, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting him to appear again, but he didn't. We got to my car, and I got in, locking the doors immediately. The drive home was quiet. My friends tried to make small talk, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting for his next opportunity. When I got home, I locked every door, every window, checked them twice. I didn't sleep that night. Every noise made me jump, every shadow felt like it was hiding something. I've gone out since then, but I'm never alone anymore. I can't shake the feeling that I was lucky that night. Too lucky. I don't know what he wanted or what he was planning, but I never want to find out. I rented the cabin to get away for the weekend. Just wanted some peace and quiet, away from the city, away from everything. It was one of those places that's miles out in the woods, no neighbors, no phone signal. Perfect for me at the time. I got there late in the afternoon. The cabin was small but cozy, all wood paneling and big windows looking out into the trees. It had a fireplace, a little kitchen, and one bedroom. Nothing fancy, but it felt right. I unpacked my stuff, settled in, and sat down with a beer, feeling like I'd finally have a weekend where I could just breathe. The first thing I noticed that seemed off was the windows. On the inside of them, there were these strange little marks. Like scratches or symbols. I don't know. At first, I figured it was nothing. Maybe just wear and tear from previous renters, or maybe an animal trying to get in. They were small, almost like someone had dragged a knife lightly over the glass. I didn't think too much about it. After I made some dinner, I noticed the same marks on the door too, near the handle. It was the same thing, like someone had scratched the wood with something sharp. I ran my finger over them, but they weren't deep, just faint lines. Again, I shrugged it off. Old place, probably nothing. That night, I built a fire and sat on the couch, listening to the woods outside. It was dead quiet, no cars, no voices, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the cabin settling. I should have felt relaxed, but I couldn't shake a weird feeling. It was like someone was watching me, even though I was alone. I got up a couple of times to check the windows, but there was nothing out there except darkness. I laughed at myself, thinking I was just being paranoid. I went to bed around midnight. The bedroom window was cracked open to let some fresh air in, but after lying there for a while, I got up and closed it. I thought I heard something outside, like footsteps. I listened for a minute, but it stopped. I told myself it was probably a deer or something, but I still locked the window just to be safe. The next morning, I woke up early and went outside to stretch my legs. That's when I saw the footprints. They were all around the cabin, fresh ones, too, in the dirt and mud. At first, I thought maybe I'd made them the day before, but then I looked closer and saw that they were bigger than mine, and there were way more than I could have made. Some of them were right up against the cabin walls, near the windows and the door. It didn't make any sense. I was miles away from anyone. The nearest house was over an hour's drive. I stood there for a while, staring at the prints, trying to figure out who could have been walking around the cabin in the middle of the night. They led off into the woods, disappearing into the trees, but I wasn't about to follow them. I went back inside and locked the door. I felt stupid for not doing it last night. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was probably a hunter or a hiker who got lost, but deep down, I didn't believe it. There was something about the way those prints were so close to the cabin, like someone had been watching me. The rest of the day, I stayed inside. I tried to read, watched a movie on my laptop, but I couldn't focus. Every now and then, I'd look out the window, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the woods were still, quiet. Around sunset, I went outside again to get some firewood. As I was stacking it, I noticed the marks on the window had gotten worse. The scratches were deeper now, more noticeable. I knew they hadn't been that bad yesterday. It looked like someone had been at it again, dragging something sharp over the glass. The door had more scratches, too, like someone had been trying to get inside. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, sitting by the fire, listening. Every little sound made my heart race. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps again, but this time they were closer, just outside. I turned off the lights and sat in the dark, staring out the window, waiting. I didn't see anyone, but the footsteps kept going, circling the cabin slowly, like whoever it was knew I was inside. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually, the footsteps stopped. I waited a long time before I moved, too scared to even breathe. When I finally did get up, I went to the window and looked outside. The moon was out, lighting up the yard, and I could see the footprints again, fresh ones, all around the cabin, just like before. I grabbed my keys and decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my stuff in record time, threw it in the car, and took off. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw something in my rearview mirror, a figure, standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. I didn't stop to get a better look. I just kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest the whole way back to the main road. When I got home, I called the rental company and told them everything. They acted surprised, said they hadn't had any other complaints. But I could tell they didn't really believe me. They probably thought I was overreacting or making it up. I don't know what I expected them to do. I didn't go back, though. I didn't even ask for a refund. I was just glad to be out of there, away from that place and whatever was out in those woods. I still think about it sometimes, wonder who or what was out there, and what would have happened if I'd stayed another night. Maybe it was just some messed up prank, or maybe there's someone living out there, messing with anyone who gets too close. I don't know. But I do know one thing, I'm never going back to that cabin again. I left work late that night. It was almost 10, and the office was empty except for a few people on the upper floors. My desk was the last one lit, and I could feel the exhaustion in my bones as I packed up my things. I just wanted to get home. When I stepped out into the parking garage, it was quiet, like it always was that late. I could hear the hum of the city outside, but inside the garage, it felt isolated. My car was parked on the far end, near the back wall where the lights flickered sometimes. The sound of my footsteps echoed as I walked toward it. Halfway to my car, I thought I heard something behind me, just a shuffle, like a foot dragging on the concrete. I stopped and looked around, but the garage was empty. I didn't see anyone, and I told myself it was just my imagination. It had been a long day, and I was probably just hearing things. I kept walking, my heels clicking on the ground. But then I heard it again, louder this time, like someone was walking behind me. I stopped again and turned around quickly. Still, no one. The garage stretched out in front of me, empty rows of cars, all still, no sign of movement. My heart started racing a little, but I brushed it off and kept walking. I was almost to my car. I pulled out my keys, holding them tight in my hand. The footsteps behind me started again, and this time they were quicker, like whoever it was had picked up their pace to match mine. I didn't look back this time. I hurried to my car, unlocking it as I got closer. I kept listening, hoping the sound would stop, but it didn't. The footsteps kept getting closer, almost right behind me now. I could hear the soft thud of shoes hitting the concrete, steady and deliberate. I broke into a jog, my heart pounding in my chest. I was so close to my car, I could see the headlights reflecting the dim light of the garage. I hit the unlock button again, just to make sure. The footsteps behind me sped up too, faster now, like whoever it was almost running. I turned around, but again, nothing. Just empty cars and darkness stretching behind me. But the sound hadn't stopped. It was like the footsteps were right there, just a few feet away, even though I couldn't see anyone. My breathing was fast now, panic creeping in as I fumbled to open the car door. I jumped inside, slamming the door shut and locking it immediately. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The car roared to life, but before I could pull out, I looked up through the windshield, expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But there was no one. I sat there for a second, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The garage was still empty. The footsteps had stopped the moment I got inside. I didn't know what to think. It had been so real, I was sure someone had been following me. I backed out of the spot as fast as I could, the tires screeching on the concrete as I pulled out of the garage. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, surrounded by the city lights and the noise of traffic. Only then did I feel like I could breathe again. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me drive away. But the street behind me was empty. I drove the rest of the way home with the radio off, too on edge to listen to anything. My mind kept replaying the sound of those footsteps, getting closer and closer. When I got home, I parked in the driveway and sat in the car for a minute, my hands still gripping the steering wheel. I didn't want to get out, didn't want to hear those footsteps again. But nothing happened. The street was quiet, just the hum of distant traffic. I finally got out, locked the car, and hurried inside my house. I double-checked all the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. Even though I was home, safe, I still couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been following me. That night, I didn't sleep well. Every sound in the house made me jump. I kept thinking about the parking garage, the echo of footsteps behind me, how real it had felt. But the strangest part was that I never saw anyone. Whoever or whatever it was stayed just out of sight the entire time. The next morning, I was still shaken. I got up earlier than usual and left for work with plenty of time to spare. I parked my car in a different spot, closer to the elevators, where the lights were brighter. The garage was busier in the mornings, with people coming and going, so I didn't feel as uneasy. But every now and then, when I walked through the garage after work, I'd catch myself listening for the sound of footsteps behind me. Even though it never happened again, I could never shake the feeling that someone or something had been there that night. Following me. Waiting. I went camping alone last weekend, something I've done plenty of times before. I like the quiet and being out there with nothing but the trees and the wind. I set up camp near a small clearing, a good spot, away from any trails or other people. No one was around for miles, or so I thought. The first day went fine. I spent the afternoon hiking, taking in the views, then came back to camp to start a fire and cook dinner. It was peaceful. By the time the sun went down, I was pretty tired, so I turned in early, zipped up my tent, and lay there listening to the sounds of the woods. Nothing unusual, just a typical rustling of leaves and an occasional hoot from an owl somewhere in the distance. I drifted off to sleep easily. I don't know what time it was when I woke up, but it was pitch black outside, no moonlight, just complete darkness. At first, I didn't know why I was awake. Everything seemed quiet, but then I heard it. A faint noise, like someone going through something. It was coming from right outside my tent. I stayed still, holding my breath. It wasn't an animal. I could tell by the sound. It was too deliberate, like hands rummaging through my gear. My heart started pounding in my chest as I listened. I reached for my phone to check the time, 2:47 a.m. I thought about calling someone, but there was no signal this far out. The sound of zippers being opened reached me. Someone was going through my backpack. My stomach sank. Who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? My mind raced as I tried to think of what to do. I didn't have any weapons, just a pocket knife in my bag, and that wasn't going to help me now. I shifted slightly, trying not to make any noise, but the fabric of my sleeping bag crinkled under me. That's when everything went silent. Whoever was out there had heard me. I waited, barely breathing, but the silence stretched on, like they were waiting too. I wanted to look outside, but fear kept me frozen in place. I told myself to stay calm, to listen. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps. They weren't walking away. They were coming toward the tent. I squeezed my eyes shut, hoping I was just imagining it, but the footsteps stopped right next to me. I could hear them breathing, shallow and steady, just outside the thin layer of nylon separating me from whoever was out there. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure they could hear it. I didn't move, didn't even blink, just lay there pretending to be asleep. I could feel them standing there, waiting. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, moving away from the tent. I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe they were leaving, but then I heard it, the sound of something being strapped on, buckles clicking. I realized they were putting on my backpack. I couldn't stay there any longer. I had to know who it was. Slowly, as quietly as I could, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek out. My eyes had adjusted to the dark by now, and in the faint light from the dying embers of the fire, I saw him. He was standing there, facing the tent, wearing my backpack. He wasn't looking through my things anymore. He was just staring directly at me, like he knew I was watching him. I froze, my hand gripping the zipper, not sure what to do. He didn't move, just stood there, staring. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his eyes locked onto mine, and a chill ran down my spine. It was like he was waiting for me to do something. I slowly backed into the tent, pulling the zipper shut as quietly as possible. I didn't want to make any sudden movements. I didn't know what this guy wanted, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. There was no one out here to help me, no way to call for help. It was just me and him. I grabbed my boots and quietly slipped them on, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't dare make a sound. My only thought was to get out of there, get away from him. But every time I moved, I expected to hear him come after me. I waited, listening for any sign that he was still out there. The fire had burned down to almost nothing, and the only sound was the wind through the trees. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I knew he hadn't left. I decided I had to make a run for it. There was a trail about a half-mile back that led to the main road. If I could get there, maybe I could find help. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and peeked out again. He wasn't there. I slipped out of the tent, keeping low to the ground. My backpack was gone, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out of there. I started moving toward the trail, careful not to make any noise. Every step felt like it took forever. As I got closer to the edge of the clearing, I glanced back at the tent. That's when I saw him again. He was standing by the tent, watching me. I hadn't heard him move, but there he was, just standing there, like he had been the whole time. I didn't wait. I took off running, not caring about the noise anymore. My only thought was to get to the trail, to get as far away from him as possible. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps fast, but not running. Just walking quickly, like he knew I wouldn't get far. My lungs burned as I sprinted through the trees. The trail was just ahead. I could see the break in the woods where it started. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept running, my heart pounding in my ears. When I hit the trail, I didn't stop. I ran and ran, the footsteps behind me fading, but I didn't dare slow down. I didn't stop until I reached the road, my legs shaking and my breath coming in gasps. I collapsed onto the pavement, looking back toward the woods, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps, no rustling in the trees. Just silence. I don't know how long I sat there before I finally got up and started walking down the road. Eventually, I made it to a small gas station, where I called the police. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. My backpack was gone, and so were all my things. I was driving home late one night, taking the back roads like I usually do when I want to avoid traffic. It was quiet out there, just the headlights of my car cutting through the dark and the occasional flicker of a farmhouse in the distance. The road was long and empty, stretching on for miles. At first, it was kind of peaceful. Just me, the hum of the engine, and the open road. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed a pair of headlights in my rearview mirror. A truck, one of those big ones, came up fast behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured they'd pass me or turn off somewhere, but they didn't. The truck stayed close, right on my bumper, way too close for comfort. I tried to ignore it, but the way it was tailgating me started to make me nervous. It was so close I could see the grill of the truck in my rearview mirror. I sped up a little, thinking maybe they'd back off, but the truck matched my speed, staying right there. I was getting more uneasy by the minute. I pressed on the gas again, but the truck stayed on me, like it was chasing me. I wasn't speeding too much, maybe 10 over, but that truck kept following me, not letting up. It didn't make sense. We were out in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't passed any turns in miles. I couldn't figure out why they were doing this. My heart was pounding, and I started to feel the cold sweat creeping in. I told myself it was nothing, that they'd probably just pass soon, but something about the way they were following me didn't feel right. I saw a gas station coming up on the right, a little one, just one pump, but the lights were on, and I figured it'd be a good place to stop. Maybe they'd just keep going if I pulled off the road. I slowed down, signaling to turn into the station. The truck slowed too, still right behind me. My stomach dropped. I pulled into the lot, parked near the pump, and waited. The truck followed, pulling in right behind me and stopping a few feet away. The engine rumbled as they sat there, headlights still on, aimed straight at my car. I stayed in my seat, gripping the steering wheel. I didn't know what to do. There was no one else at the gas station, no other cars around, and the place looked like it hadn't seen much business in years. I could feel my heart racing. I told myself to stay calm, but it wasn't working. I kept glancing at the truck in the mirror, hoping they'd just get out, pump their gas, and leave me alone. But they didn't. The driver didn't move. They just sat there, staring at me through their windshield. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching me. Every second felt longer, the tension thick in the air. I debated getting out of the car, but something in my gut told me to stay put. After a minute that felt like forever, I decided to move. I turned the key in the ignition and pulled my car forward a little, closer to the store. The truck's engine revved, and it followed, stopping again as soon as I did. My chest tightened. I was trapped, and whoever was in that truck wasn't letting me leave. I glanced around the lot. The lights above the pumps were dim, flickering a little, and there wasn't a single person in sight. The store looked closed, the windows dark, and I didn't see any movement inside. There was no help coming from there. I felt the panic rising, but I didn't want to make any sudden moves. I turned my head and saw the driver's door of the truck open. A man stepped out. He was tall, broad, wearing a jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He didn't say anything, just started walking toward my car, slow and steady like he had all the time in the world. I felt frozen, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight they hurt. I didn't know what to do. My phone was on the passenger seat, but I was shaking too much to even reach for it. The man kept walking, getting closer and closer. He wasn't in a hurry, but his footsteps echoed in my ears, each one louder than the last. I couldn't take it anymore. My instincts kicked in, and I slammed my car into reverse, tires squealing as I backed up. The man stopped in his tracks, staring at me. I didn't care. I threw the car into drive and sped out of the gas station lot, my heart racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. The truck's engine roared behind me. They were coming after me again. I floored it, my car flying down the empty road. The truck stayed right behind me, closer than ever. My hands were trembling, and I struggled to keep the car steady. The road twisted and turned, but I didn't slow down. I couldn't. The truck was relentless, its headlights blinding in my rearview mirror. I saw a fork in the road up ahead. Without thinking, I veered left, taking the smaller road that led toward the hills. I knew it wasn't smart, taking a more isolated route, but I had to lose them. I had no other choice. The road narrowed, winding through trees and steep drops. I prayed the truck wouldn't follow, but when I glanced back, there it was, still behind me, relentless. I pushed my car as hard as it would go, feeling every bump and curve in the road. My eyes flicked between the road and the truck behind me, waiting for it to fall back, but it didn't. It kept coming. Then, up ahead, I saw another turn off. It was a dirt path leading into the woods, barely visible in the dark, but I took it without hesitation. My car bounced and jolted on the rough terrain, but I didn't slow down. I didn't care where the path led. I just needed to get away. The truck couldn't follow me down the narrow path. I could hear its tires screech as it tried to stop at the entrance, but it was too wide to make the turn. I kept driving, my heart still racing, but the headlights were finally fading behind me. I didn't stop until I was deep into the woods, far enough that I couldn't hear the truck anymore. When I finally stopped the car, I sat there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know who they were or why they'd been following me, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was working the night shift at the convenience store, just like any other Friday. It was a quiet night, barely any customers coming in, which was normal for the time. Most people were at home or out at bars, not stopping by for snacks and smokes. I'd been there since 10 p.m., and I wasn't getting off until 6 a.m., so I had a long night ahead of me. Around midnight, a group of 4 guys came in. They looked like they were in their 20s, maybe younger, and from the way they were dressed, I could tell they weren't just stopping by from a party or anything. They didn't fit that type. Something about them felt off right away, but I didn't pay it much mind at first. People come in all the time looking strange. It's a convenience store at night. You see all kinds. They wandered around the store for a bit, not really picking anything up. They didn't split up either, just moved in a little pack, looking at the shelves and whispering to each other. I could see them from the corner of my eye, but I tried not to stare. I was hoping they'd grab what they wanted and leave, but they didn't pick up anything. They just kept looking. One of them, the tallest guy, kept glancing at me. Every time I'd look up, there he was, staring. Then he'd turn and whisper to his friends, and they'd all laugh quietly. I wasn't sure if they were messing with me or if they were just being weird. I've seen my share of odd customers, so I wasn't going to jump to conclusions. But still, it made me uncomfortable. After about 10 minutes of them not buying anything, I started to feel more on edge. Normally, people come in, grab what they need, and leave. But these guys weren't doing that. They were just hanging around, like they had nothing better to do. I decided to watch them a little closer, just in case. They made their way toward the drink coolers at the back of the store, still not taking anything. I thought maybe they were looking for something specific and couldn't find it, but they weren't asking me for help either. I could hear them whispering again, and it felt like they were talking about me. Every time one of them would glance my way, my stomach would twist a little more. I was trying to stay calm, but the way they were acting didn't sit right with me. It was just us in the store. No other customers, no one else around. If something happened, no one would be here to see it. I reached under the counter and felt for the panic button, just to make sure it was there. I'd never had to use it before, but the thought crossed my mind more than once that night. After what felt like forever, they finally started moving toward the door. I let out a quiet breath, thinking maybe they were going to leave. But instead of going outside, they stopped near the entrance, still talking in low voices. The tall one leaned against the doorframe, just staring at me. The others stood by him, whispering and occasionally laughing. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just tell them to leave. They hadn't done anything yet, not really. But the way they were acting, it wasn't normal. My hands started to feel sweaty, and I could feel my heartbeat getting faster. I didn't want to show that I was nervous, though. I kept my eyes on the counter, pretending to check something on the register, but I could feel them watching me. They stayed there, by the door, for at least another 5 minutes. One of them pulled out his phone and was texting or something, but he kept looking up at me while he did it. The tall one never stopped staring. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were planning something, but I didn't know what. The store felt smaller all of a sudden, like the walls were closing in on me. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, that it was just a bunch of bored guys trying to kill time, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly 1 a.m. My shift had barely started, and I already wanted to be anywhere but there. Finally, the tall one pushed off the doorframe and walked back toward the counter. My stomach dropped. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking down at me from across the counter. His friends stayed by the door, watching. I didn't move. I couldn't. "You got a bathroom?" he asked, his voice low and kind of rough. I nodded, pointing to the back of the store. "Yeah, it's by the coolers." "But it's for customers only," I added, hoping he'd get the hint. He didn't. He just grinned at me, a slow, crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll be quick," he said, then turned and motioned for his friends to follow him. They all headed to the back, and I felt a little relief when they were out of my sight, but not much. I kept an ear out for the bathroom door, waiting to hear it close, but it didn't. I heard their footsteps stop near the coolers, and that was it. I didn't know what they were doing, but I didn't like it. I had the phone next to me, ready to call someone if I needed to. A couple minutes passed, and they still hadn't come back. I was getting more and more nervous by the second. I decided to go to the back and see what was going on, but just as I stepped out from behind the counter, I heard the door chime. Someone had walked in. It was an older guy, maybe in his 50s, wearing a worn-out jacket and a baseball cap. He looked like a regular, just stopping by for some snacks. He didn't notice me right away, but the second I saw him, I felt a wave of relief. Someone else was in the store now. I wasn't alone. I stayed behind the counter, watching as he walked toward the aisles. He seemed normal, didn't even glance at the guys in the back. They hadn't come out yet. I still didn't know what they were up to, but at least I wasn't completely alone anymore. The older guy grabbed a few things and came up to the counter. He smiled, a friendly sort of smile, and I tried my best to smile back, but it probably looked more like a grimace. My hands were shaking as I rang him up, and I could feel my heart pounding again. I just needed those guys to leave. That's all I wanted. As soon as I finished with the old guy's transaction, he left, and the door chime sounded again. The second he was gone, I heard footsteps coming from the back. My heart sank. The 4 guys came back to the front, still not holding anything. The tall one grinned at me again, that same creepy smile, and nodded toward the door. "Thanks," he said, as if they actually used the bathroom. I didn't respond, just watched as they finally left the store. They didn't hurry. They walked out slow, almost like they were daring me to say something, but I kept my mouth shut. The door chime rang again as they stepped outside, and I let out a shaky breath. I watched them through the windows, waiting for them to get in their truck and leave. But they didn't. They stood outside, talking to each other again, glancing at the store every now and then. I couldn't hear them, but I knew they were still talking about me. I couldn't take it anymore. I reached under the counter and pressed the panic button, just in case. I wasn't sure if anything would happen, but it made me feel a little better, knowing I'd done something. About 5 minutes later, they finally got into their truck and drove off. I didn't relax until I couldn't see their headlights anymore. Even then, I didn't feel completely safe. I just stood behind the counter, my hands still shaking, waiting for the end of my shift. I went hiking alone on a Saturday morning. It was supposed to be a quick trail, one I had done before. The sun was out, and there were other hikers here and there. Nothing felt off at first. I was enjoying the peace and quiet, the sounds of the birds and the wind through the trees. It was relaxing. That's why I like going alone. It gave me time to think. About halfway through, I decided to take a small detour. There was a side path I'd seen before, but never took. I thought it would loop back around to the main trail, and I figured it'd be nice to explore a bit. It didn't seem dangerous. People went off the main trail all the time. I walked for maybe 30 minutes before I realized I hadn't seen any other hikers in a while. The path was less clear, narrower, and the trees were thicker. I stopped to check my phone, but of course, I had no signal. That didn't worry me too much at first. I had water, snacks, and the trail couldn't be too far off. I turned around and started walking back the way I came, but it didn't feel right. After 10 minutes, I wasn't seeing anything familiar. The path looked different, like I hadn't been on it before. I wasn't even sure which way I had come from anymore. I started to panic a little, but I told myself to stay calm. I could still find my way back. It was a popular area. Someone would come by eventually, and I could just follow them. Another hour passed, and I hadn't seen a single person. The sun was lower in the sky, and I knew I didn't have much daylight left. That's when I heard voices. It was faint at first, just some laughter and talking, but it was enough to give me hope. I followed the sound, thinking maybe I had finally found other hikers or a ranger or something. I walked through the trees, and the voices got louder. But when I finally saw them, it wasn't what I expected. There was a group of 4 people, all sitting around a fire. They were camping, but not in any designated spot. It was clear they weren't supposed to be there. Their tents were set up haphazardly, and the fire was too big for the small clearing they were in. Something about it felt wrong. I stood there for a second, not sure if I should approach them. They hadn't seen me yet, but I was lost, and they were the first people I'd found in hours. I didn't have much of a choice. So I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey," I called out, waving a little. I think I got turned around. "Do you know which way the main trail is?" All 4 of them stopped talking and looked at me at the same time. The way they stared, it wasn't friendly. They didn't seem confused or concerned, just annoyed. One of the guys stood up. He was tall, a little scruffy, wearing a dirty flannel shirt. The others stayed seated, watching me. "You're lost?" he asked, his voice flat. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep calm. "I just need to get back to the main trail." "Do you know where it is?" He didn't answer right away. He just stared at me for a second, then looked back at his friends. They exchanged a glance, and one of the women laughed under her breath, but it wasn't a normal laugh. It sounded mocking. "I don't think there's a trail nearby," the guy said finally. "You're a little far from the regular spots." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Something wasn't right. I took a step back, trying to figure out what to do. They were clearly not normal hikers. Their camp was messy, and the way they were acting was making me nervous. I wasn't sure if I should stay and try to ask more questions or just leave. "I'll keep looking, then," I said, turning to go. "Wait," the guy called after me. "You shouldn't wander off alone. It's easy to get more lost out here." I paused. His tone had changed. It wasn't concerned. It sounded more like a suggestion, but not in a good way. The others hadn't stopped staring at me, and I felt their eyes on my back. I didn't want to stay, but I didn't want to run either. "I'll be fine," I said quickly. "Thanks anyway." I started walking away, trying to stay calm, but I could hear footsteps behind me. He was following me. My heart started racing, and I picked up my pace, hoping he'd give up and go back to his camp. But the footsteps didn't stop. "Hey," he called again, his voice closer now. "Where are you headed? You don't even know where you are." I kept walking, faster this time, but I was starting to panic. I didn't know the way back, and I didn't want to run, but everything in me was screaming to get away from him. I could hear his footsteps getting closer, and when I glanced over my shoulder, he was only a few feet behind me. "I can help you find the trail," he said, his voice lower now, almost like he was trying to keep it quiet. "No, thanks," I said, not looking back again. I was almost jogging at this point, trying to put some distance between us. Then I heard the others. They were getting up, too. The voices from the camp were getting louder, and I could hear more footsteps behind me. I wasn't sure how many of them were following me, but it didn't matter. I broke into a full run. I didn't know where I was going, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from them. I could hear them running behind me, shouting something, but I didn't stop to listen. The trees were thick, and the ground was uneven, but I kept running, my heart pounding in my chest. After what felt like forever, I couldn't hear them anymore. I slowed down, gasping for breath, and looked around. I had no idea where I was. The sun was almost gone, and the woods were getting darker by the minute. I kept moving, not as fast now, but I didn't stop. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting them to be right behind me again. Eventually, I stumbled onto what looked like a trail. It wasn't the main one, but it was something. I followed it, hoping it would lead me somewhere safe. It felt like hours passed before I finally saw the parking lot. There were a few cars left, and mine was still there, thank God. I practically ran to it, fumbling with my keys before I finally got the door open. I didn't stop shaking until I was miles away from the trailhead. I still don't know who those people were or what they wanted, but I'm never hiking alone again. I had been out with friends at a bar, and by the time I decided to call it a night, it was already late. I ordered a rideshare to get home. The bar was a bit out of the way, so I was relieved when the car pulled up on time. It was a regular sedan, and the driver greeted me with a polite smile as I got in. I said my address and we started driving. At first, everything was fine. The driver was making small talk, asking about my night and telling me a little about his own. It was friendly enough. I answered briefly, too tired to engage much. I wanted to get home and go to bed. The route was familiar, and I felt comfortable enough. We got onto the highway, and the driver turned off into a residential area that was not part of my usual route. I thought maybe there was some traffic on the highway, and he was taking a detour. But then, he made a sharp turn onto a road I didn't recognize. That made me sit up a bit straighter. I checked the GPS on my phone. We were clearly not heading towards my home. I tried to stay calm. Maybe he was just lost or making a mistake. I looked at the driver through the rearview mirror, but his expression was focused and calm. He didn't seem like he was in any sort of distress. I started to feel uneasy. I asked him, "Excuse me, I think you might have missed my turn." He didn't respond immediately. He kept driving, and that's when I noticed something even more alarming. The doors were locked. I tried to open the door, but it was firmly shut. I started to panic. My mind raced with thoughts. I tried calling my friend to tell her what was happening, but there was no signal. I was stuck. I had never felt so vulnerable. I didn't want to make the driver angry or provoke him, so I tried to stay calm. I asked him again, "Can you please tell me where we are going? This isn't the way to my house." This time, he glanced at me through the mirror, but his eyes were cold. He didn't say anything. The car kept moving, and I could see that the buildings outside were becoming more sparse. I looked around frantically, trying to figure out where we might be. There were no familiar landmarks, no street signs I recognized. My heart pounded as the car continued to drive deeper into a more isolated area. I started to think about how to escape, but the car was moving too quickly. I noticed a small house up ahead, and I thought maybe there was a chance to get help if I could get out. I had to act quickly. I grabbed my phone and tried to use it to call 911, but I still had no signal. My throat felt dry, and I could barely think straight. I watched as the driver slowed down near the house, and for a moment, I thought he might stop there. But instead, he just kept driving past it. I realized then that this was deliberate. He wasn't lost, he knew exactly where he was going. The car continued down the road, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I noticed the driver was glancing at me occasionally through the mirror. It was clear he was aware of my growing fear. The realization hit me hard. He wasn't planning to drop me off at home. I had to come up with a plan. I looked around again, spotting a few cars parked along the road. I decided that if we stopped for any reason, I would have to act fast. I considered how to get out of the car in an emergency, but the locked doors made it difficult. The driver turned onto a dirt road. The car jolted as it drove over uneven terrain. I knew I had to do something soon. I glanced at the driver again, trying to gauge his intentions. He wasn't showing any signs of aggression, but his lack of communication and the locked doors were enough to make me extremely anxious. Finally, the car stopped in a secluded area near some trees. The driver put the car in park and turned off the engine. I could feel my heart racing. This was my chance. I needed to make a move before it was too late. I took a deep breath and said, "Please let me out. I want to get out of the car now." My voice shook, but I tried to keep it steady. The driver didn't respond. I reached for the door handle, trying to unlock it manually, but it was no use. I saw the driver reaching for something under his seat, and that's when I knew I had to act fast. I decided to make a run for it. I pulled on the door with all my strength, and finally, the lock gave way. I pushed the door open and stumbled out of the car. I ran towards the trees, hoping to find some cover. I heard the driver yelling something behind me, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I reached the road. I finally saw headlights in the distance and waved frantically. A car stopped, and I ran up to it. The driver of the car let me in and called the police for me. I was shaken and scared, but I was safe. The police arrived shortly and checked the area, but the rideshare driver was gone. They took my statement and advised me to stay safe and be cautious with rideshares in the future. I got home later that night, but I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind. It was the scariest experience of my life. I still get anxious whenever I think about rideshares now. I was on a road trip, driving through the middle of nowhere, trying to make it to the next town before dark. The road stretched out in front of me, miles of nothing. Eventually, I noticed the gas gauge was dipping close to empty. There wasn't much around, but I saw a small gas station up ahead. It was one of those old, run-down places that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I figured it would do the job, though, so I pulled in. There was only one pump, and the place seemed deserted at first. Then, a guy came out of the little building attached to the station. He was tall, thin, and had this big smile plastered on his face, like he was just too eager to see someone. I rolled down my window and asked him if the pump worked. He said it did, then insisted on pumping the gas for me. It was weird because I wasn't used to people doing that anymore, but I thought maybe it was just how things worked out here. As he started pumping, he kept talking, asking where I was from, where I was headed, and if I was traveling alone. I didn't really want to answer him, so I just gave vague replies, hoping he'd get the hint. But he didn't stop. He kept going, acting overly friendly, his questions getting a little too personal. It was starting to make me uncomfortable, but I figured I just needed to pay and get out of there. I told him I'd go inside to pay, and he nodded, still smiling. I walked toward the building, feeling his eyes on my back the whole time. When I stepped inside, It was dimly lit, with old shelves of snacks and drinks that looked like they'd been there for years. Behind the counter was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, who barely looked up when I entered. As I was pulling out my wallet, I glanced out the window. That's when I saw the guy who had been pumping my gas. He wasn't at the pump anymore. Instead, he was standing off to the side of the building, talking to two other men. These two were rough-looking, dressed in dirty clothes, and they kept glancing over in my direction. One of them had his arms crossed, and the other was nodding as the gas station guy pointed at me. My stomach dropped. I didn't know what they were talking about, but it didn't feel right. I quickly paid for the gas and walked back outside, trying to act normal. As soon as I stepped out, the two men stopped talking and just stared at me. The gas station guy was back at the pump, leaning against it, still smiling, but now it looked forced, like he was trying too hard. I got back into my car, trying not to look at them, and started the engine. The gas station guy walked over to my window again, tapping on it. I rolled it down just a crack. He leaned in, still grinning, and said something about how I should be careful on these roads, that there'd been a lot of accidents lately. His tone was friendly, but there was something off about it. I just nodded, rolled the window back up, and pulled out of there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The two men had walked back around to the side of the building, and the gas station guy was still standing there, watching me. I felt a sense of relief as I put more distance between me and the station, but it didn't last long. A few minutes later, I noticed headlights behind me. I hadn't seen another car for miles, so it was strange to have one tailing me now. The car kept its distance at first, but after a few miles, it started creeping closer. I couldn't make out who was inside, but I had a bad feeling about it. I sped up a little, hoping they'd back off, but they matched my speed. I didn't want to panic, but I could feel the tension building in my chest. I didn't know if it was the guys from the gas station or just some random car, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I kept driving, hoping to see a town or at least some sign of civilization, but the road stretched on with nothing but trees and darkness. The car behind me was getting closer, its headlights practically blinding me in the mirror. I knew I couldn't outrun them forever, but I wasn't about to stop either. Then, without warning, the car sped up and pulled alongside me. I glanced over and saw the two men from the gas station. They were both glaring at me, their expressions hard, and one of them was gesturing for me to pull over. My heart was racing now. I didn't know what they wanted, but it couldn't be good. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to stay focused, but they swerved toward me, trying to force me off the road. I jerked the wheel to avoid them, barely staying in my lane. They pulled ahead a little, then slowed down, trying to box me in. I didn't know what to do. There was no one else around, no help coming. It was just me and them. I kept driving, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. They were trying to push me off the road again, but I managed to swerve and stay on course. After a few more attempts, they sped up and disappeared ahead of me, their taillights fading into the distance. I didn't slow down. I wasn't sure if they were waiting for me up ahead or if they'd given up, but I wasn't taking any chances. I kept driving until I finally saw the lights of a small town in the distance. My muscles were tense the whole way, expecting them to come back, but they never did. When I reached the town, I pulled into a well-lit parking lot and just sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. My hands were shaking, and my heart was still pounding in my chest. I couldn't believe what had just happened. I stayed in that parking lot for a while, just trying to collect myself before heading out again. I never found out who those men were or what they wanted, but I'm sure they were planning something. I've been on a lot of road trips since then, but I always make sure to fill up my tank before I hit any long stretches of road. I'm not taking any chances like that again. I rented the lake house to get away for a few days. It was small, old, and a little out of the way, but it seemed perfect for what I needed, a quiet weekend alone. I pulled up late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The house sat close to the water, with a narrow dirt path leading from the driveway to the front door. The place looked worn but cozy, surrounded by trees on three sides, with the lake right in front. I unpacked my things and settled in quickly. The inside was simple, a small living room, a tiny kitchen, and a bedroom upstairs. It felt empty, but I liked that. I made myself some dinner, had a glass of wine, and watched the sun dip behind the trees across the lake. By the time it got dark, the whole place was pitch black except for a faint glow from the moon reflecting off the water. It wasn't long after I turned off the lights and got into bed that I heard the first tap. It was quiet, almost like a branch brushing against the window. I didn't think much of it at first. The wind could have been moving the trees around, or it might have been the old house settling. I closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep, but then I heard it again. This time, it was clearer. A distinct tap, like something or someone was deliberately tapping on the glass. I sat up in bed, listening, my heart already starting to pound. It came again. Tap. 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 It was coming from the window downstairs, near the living room. I didn't want to move, but I couldn't just ignore it either. I grabbed my phone, got out of bed, and crept down the stairs as quietly as I could. The tapping had stopped by the time I reached the bottom of the stairs. The living room was dark, but I could see the faint outline of the window. I walked over, slowly, trying to keep my breathing steady. I pulled back the curtain and looked outside. There was nothing. Just the empty yard, the trees, and the still surface of the lake. I stood there for a minute, staring into the darkness, half expecting to see something move. But everything was quiet. I finally let out a breath and went back upstairs, convincing myself it was just the wind after all. I got back into bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept listening for the sound, waiting for it to come back, but it didn't. The next morning, I went outside to get some fresh air and clear my head. I walked around to the side of the house, the side where the window was. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, but there were enough of them to be noticeable. Muddy prints leading from the trees to the window and then back into the woods. I froze. The prints were too big to be mine, and I hadn't walked around that side of the house at all. Whoever had made them had been standing right by the window, tapping on it. Watching. I felt sick to my stomach, and my first instinct was to pack up and leave. But I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was someone passing by, maybe a hiker who got too close. I didn't want to ruin my weekend, so I pushed the thought away and went back inside. The rest of the day was uneventful. I tried to relax, went down to the lake for a bit, and even took a nap in the afternoon. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced toward the trees, it felt like there was someone hiding just out of sight. By the time night fell, I was on edge again, jumping at every little sound. I stayed up late, reading on the couch, trying to distract myself. It was past midnight when I heard the tapping again. This time it was louder, more insistent. I froze, my heart racing. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a tree branch. It was deliberate. I didn't want to go to the window. I didn't want to look outside and see what was there. The tapping continued, and I felt my skin crawl. Slowly, I stood up and moved toward the window, every step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't pull back the curtain this time. I just stood there, staring at the fabric, listening to the sound of something on the other side of the glass. The tapping stopped, but I didn't move. I waited, my breath shaky, my hands clenched into fists. Then I heard a sound that sent a chill down my spine. Footsteps. Not from outside, but inside. Upstairs. I spun around, staring at the staircase. I hadn't heard anyone come in. The door was locked, the windows closed. But there was no mistaking it. Slow, deliberate footsteps, moving across the floor above me. My bedroom. My mind raced. I had no idea what to do. I could call someone, but I was miles away from town. By the time anyone got here, it would be too late. The footsteps moved closer to the top of the stairs. I backed up slowly, my eyes never leaving the staircase. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and held it in front of me like a weapon. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear anything else. Then, the footsteps stopped. The house was completely silent again. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something to happen. Minutes passed, but nothing did. Slowly, I crept toward the stairs, trying to keep my breathing steady. I needed to know if someone was up there. I needed to know if I was alone. I reached the bottom of the staircase and looked up. The second floor was dark, no sign of movement. I hesitated, then slowly started to climb, the lamp still in my hand. Each step felt like it took an eternity. When I reached the top, I turned toward my bedroom. The door was closed, just like I'd left it. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. I turned it slowly and pushed the door open. The room was empty. Everything was exactly where I'd left it. No one had been in there. But I knew what I heard. I wasn't imagining it. I backed out of the room and went back downstairs, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch with the lamp in my hand, jumping at every creak, every sound the house made. Morning couldn't come fast enough. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. I didn't even bother cleaning up. I drove straight home, and I haven't been back since. I don't know who or what was outside that window, or who was walking around upstairs. But I know I wasn't alone that weekend. Something or someone was watching me the whole time. I was driving back from a work trip late one night, trying to get home as fast as possible. It was one of those stretches of highway where there's nothing for miles, no gas stations, no houses, just trees on either side. I'd been on the road for hours, and I was getting tired. I wasn't sure I'd make it home without falling asleep behind the wheel, so when I saw a sign for a rest stop, I decided to pull over. It was just past midnight when I pulled into the lot. There was no one else around, not a single car. The place looked pretty run down, but I didn't care. I just needed to stretch my legs and maybe get a quick nap. I parked my car near the entrance, next to the building with the restrooms, and got out. The night was quiet, too quiet. No sounds, no wind, not even crickets. Just this thick, dead silence. I stood there for a minute, stretching my legs and rubbing my eyes. The lights in the parking lot flickered a little, giving everything this eerie, pale glow. The building looked old, with cracked windows and chipped paint, like it hadn't been maintained in years. I was about to head to the restroom when I saw headlights in my rearview mirror. A car was pulling into the lot. It seemed strange, given how late it was and how empty the road had been, but I didn't think much of it. I figured someone else just needed a break like me. The car parked a few spaces down from mine. A guy got out. I couldn't see him too well at first, but he was tall, wearing a dark jacket. I expected him to head to the restroom, but he didn't. Instead, he just stood by his car, looking in my direction. At first, I thought maybe he was just getting his bearings. It was late, after all. But he didn't move. He didn't go inside, didn't even seem to be doing anything with his car. He was just standing there, watching me. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe he was just tired like I was. But something about the way he was standing, so still, staring, made me uncomfortable. I turned around and pretended like I didn't notice, walking toward the restroom. As I got closer to the building, I glanced back. He was still standing there, still watching. He hadn't moved an inch. I felt this sudden, cold chill run down my spine. There was something wrong about the way he was just waiting, watching. I went into the restroom, locked the stall door behind me, and splashed some water on my face, trying to shake off the unease. But I couldn't stop thinking about that guy. Why was he just standing there? What did he want? I stayed in the restroom longer than I needed to, hoping he'd leave by the time I came out. After a few minutes, I opened the door and stepped back outside. The air felt even colder now, and the lights were flickering more than before. I looked over at the parking lot. He was still there. But now he was closer. His car hadn't moved, but he was standing closer to mine, just a few feet away. And he was still staring right at me. Not moving, not saying anything. Just standing there, like he was waiting for me to do something. My heart started pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. I thought about getting back in my car and driving off, but something told me he'd follow. There was no way I'd make it far enough before he caught up. I tried to stay calm. Maybe he was just some weirdo. Maybe he didn't mean any harm. But everything in me was screaming that something was wrong. I glanced around the lot, hoping to see another car, another person, but it was just me and him. I started walking back to my car, keeping my eyes straight ahead, trying not to look at him. I could feel his gaze on me, like it was burning a hole through my back. Every step felt heavier, my legs shaky. My hand was trembling as I reached into my pocket for my keys. I made it to my car and fumbled with the keys, glancing up for just a second. He was standing even closer now, maybe 2 parking spaces away, still watching me. His face was in shadow, but I could see enough to know he wasn't friendly. His expression was cold, hard, like he was sizing me up. I unlocked the door as fast as I could and jumped inside, slamming it shut and locking it. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. When the car finally started, I threw it into reverse and peeled out of the parking lot, glancing in the rearview mirror as I sped away. He hadn't moved. He just stood there, watching me go. For a few miles, I kept looking back, half expecting to see his car following me, but there was nothing. The road was empty again, just like before. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done. That he was still watching, waiting for the right moment. I drove faster, not caring about the speed limit, just wanting to get as far away from that place as possible. The rest of the drive was a blur. I don't even remember getting home, just the relief I felt when I finally pulled into my driveway and locked the doors behind me. I never stopped at a rest stop at night after that. I don't know what that guy wanted or what he was planning, but I wasn't going to stick around to find out. I checked into the hotel late, around 10 p.m. I had a work meeting in the morning and needed a good night's sleep. It was one of those generic chain hotels you find off the highway, nothing fancy, just a place to rest. The room they gave me was on the 2nd floor, 213. I remember the hallway being long and kind of dim, even though all the lights were on. It felt weird, but I was exhausted, so I didn't think too much of it. When I got to my room, everything seemed normal. It looked clean enough, smelled a little musty, but that's normal for a hotel room, I guess. I threw my bag down and went straight to the bathroom to wash my face and brush my teeth. I was halfway through getting ready for bed when I heard it. A faint thumping noise, like something heavy was being dragged across the floor. At first, I didn't think anything of it. I figured it was just someone moving around in the room next door. Maybe they were rearranging their luggage or something. But the noise kept going, not loud, but just persistent enough that it started to get on my nerves. I figured it would stop soon, so I got into bed and tried to ignore it. But it didn't stop. It changed. The dragging sound was gone, and instead, I heard soft tapping. Like someone was lightly knocking on the wall, but the sound was irregular, coming from different parts of the room. It was unnerving because it didn't make sense. Who would be knocking on the wall at this time of night? I tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, another knock would sound louder, closer. I sat up in bed, wide awake now, listening carefully. The noise was definitely coming from the adjoining room. I assumed someone was staying there, but it sounded like they were pacing, maybe knocking into the walls or something. It was just after midnight when I decided to call the front desk. The knocking had turned into something else, like scratching. It sounded like someone was dragging their nails down the wall, slow and deliberate. It made my skin crawl. I picked up the phone and called the front desk, asking if they could check the room next door. The guy at the desk was polite, but he sounded confused. He told me that the room next to mine, 215, was unoccupied. That didn't make sense. I heard the noises clear as day. I told him what I was hearing, and he promised to send someone up to check it out. I hung up, feeling uneasy. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps outside my door. I assumed it was hotel staff coming to check on the noise. I stayed quiet, listening, but the noises in the adjoining room stopped. There was nothing for a long while, just silence. After what felt like forever, the footsteps outside my door faded away, and the hallway was quiet again. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe the front desk was wrong, or maybe the walls were thin, and I was hearing noises from another room. I turned off the lights and got back into bed, determined to sleep. But then, the tapping started again. It was softer this time, almost like someone was lightly knocking on the wall right next to my bed. I froze, listening. The taps were coming from the exact spot where the adjoining door was, the one that connected my room to the supposedly empty room next door. I stared at the door, barely breathing. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, like whoever was on the other side was trying to get my attention. My heart was racing, and I was too scared to move. I kept staring at the door, expecting it to open, but it didn't. I grabbed my phone and called the front desk again. My hands were shaking as I explained what was happening. The guy on the phone was calm, told me he'd send someone up right away. I didn't hang up. I just sat there, clutching the phone, waiting for help to arrive. I heard the footsteps in the hall again. They were slow, like whoever was out there was taking their time. But as soon as I heard them, the knocking stopped. The silence was even worse than the noise. I didn't hear the hotel staff knock on the door or check the room next door. They just left. I waited, not sure what to do. The room felt colder, and I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was on the other side of that door, watching me, waiting. I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, clutching my phone, my eyes locked on the adjoining door. Around 3 a.m., the knocking started again, louder this time. It sounded angry, like someone was pounding on the wall with their fists. I jumped out of bed, panicking. I ran to the door and pressed my ear against it, trying to hear what was on the other side. But all I heard was the pounding. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my bag and threw on my shoes, deciding I was getting out of there. I didn't care about the time or the fact that I had nowhere else to go. I just needed to leave. As I opened my door to the hallway, I heard one final, deafening bang on the adjoining door, like someone was slamming their body against it. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I ran out of the room, down the hall, and straight to the front desk. The guy at the desk looked surprised to see me. I told him everything about the noises, the knocking, the scratching. He didn't seem to know what to say. He kept apologizing, offering to move me to another room, but I refused. I told him I was checking out early. I drove to a different hotel that night, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't sleep until I was in a different bed, far away from that place. A few days later, I got curious. I looked up the hotel online, wondering if anyone else had experienced something like I did. There were no reviews about strange noises or unoccupied rooms, but there was one thing that stood out. The room next to mine, 215, had been closed off for years. Some kind of water damage or structural issue. But that didn't explain the sounds I heard or the fact that someone or something had been trying to get through that door. I went to the grocery store around 7 p.m. It was dark out, but I wasn't worried because I had done this 100 times before. I only needed a few things, some eggs, milk, and bread. The store wasn't too crowded, just a few people here and there. I grabbed a basket and started walking down the aisles, trying to get everything I needed quickly. I was in the produce section when I first noticed him. A man, probably in his 40s, standing by the apples. At first, I didn't think anything of it. He looked normal, just another customer. But something about the way he was standing, not really picking anything, just kind of staring, felt off. I brushed it off and went to grab a head of lettuce. When I moved to the next aisle, he followed. I saw him out of the corner of my eye as I reached for a box of cereal. He wasn't pushing a cart or holding a basket, just walking slowly down the aisle, his eyes on me. I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just shopping too, I told myself. I grabbed my cereal and moved on. In the bread aisle, there he was again, standing near the end, watching me. I started to feel uncomfortable, but I wasn't sure if I was overreacting. Maybe it was just a coincidence. I picked up a loaf of bread and hurried to the dairy section. He followed. This time, I was sure of it. I walked slower, pretending to read the labels on the milk cartons, but really, I was watching him in the reflection of the cooler door. He stopped a few feet away from me, not pretending to shop at all now, just standing there, staring. My heart started racing. I didn't know what to do. I moved quickly to the next aisle, hoping to lose him. I even doubled back a few times, weaving through different sections of the store, but every time I looked up, there he was, following me, always keeping his distance but never letting me out of his sight. By the time I reached the frozen foods section, I was starting to panic. I looked around, trying to find another customer or an employee, but the store was nearly empty. The few people I did see were too far away. I could feel his eyes on me, and every time I glanced back, he was closer. I put my basket down and headed straight for the checkout lanes. I didn't care if I had gotten everything I needed, I just wanted to get out of there. As I approached the registers, I saw him again, standing near the entrance, waiting. He didn't buy anything. He hadn't picked up a single item the whole time. I paid for my groceries as quickly as I could. My hands were shaking when I handed the cashier my card. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and he was still there, just standing near the automatic doors, watching me. I wanted to tell someone, but I didn't know what to say. He hadn't done anything yet, just followed me, but it was enough to make my skin crawl. As soon as I got my receipt, I grabbed my bags and headed for the exit. I walked fast, almost running, but I could hear his footsteps behind me. When I pushed through the doors into the parking lot, the cold air hit me, and I realized I was alone out here. There were only a few cars, scattered across the lot, and mine was parked all the way at the end, under a flickering streetlight. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just kept walking, my keys clenched in my hand, ready to unlock the car the second I got close. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps echoing in the empty lot. He was walking faster now, closing the distance between us. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly that I almost dropped them. I finally managed to unlock the door and threw my bags into the passenger seat. I jumped in and slammed the door shut, locking it just as I saw him step out of the shadows, only a few feet away. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, staring at me through the window, his face blank. I started the car, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I backed out of the parking spot as fast as I could, and for a second, I thought he was going to try to stop me. But he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me drive away. I didn't breathe until I was halfway down the road, far from the store. My hands were still shaking, and my heart was racing. I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his face again, but he was gone. I didn't know what he wanted or why he had followed me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't done. Even now, days later, I keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for him to appear. I was driving across the country, just me and my car, trying to clear my head. It was one of those long, empty stretches of highway where you don't see another vehicle for miles. No cell service, no towns, just open road. I'd been driving for hours, and when I saw the guy on the side of the road, thumb out, I slowed down. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but something about him didn't seem dangerous. He looked tired, worn out, and I figured it would be nice to give him a ride, maybe talk to someone for a bit. He climbed in, tossed his small backpack in the back seat, and thanked me. His voice was calm, friendly. He looked normal, maybe a little rough around the edges, but nothing that set off any alarms. I asked him where he was heading, and he said he didn't have anywhere specific in mind, just trying to get to the next town. I nodded, not thinking much of it. We drove for a while in silence. At first, the conversation was fine. We talked about the weather, where we were from, and the kind of stuff you'd expect. I told him I was on a road trip, trying to see the country, and he said he was doing the same, though he didn't go into details. I didn't press. After a bit, he started asking about my family. I thought it was a little strange, but I didn't want to be rude, so I answered vaguely. I said I had family back east and left it at that. Then he asked if I was traveling alone. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I didn't want to make things awkward. I just nodded and said yeah, I was by myself. He didn't say anything for a few minutes, just stared out the window, and I could feel the tension in the car start to build. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, and he was just sitting there, quiet, but something felt off. He broke the silence by asking if I ever got scared being out on these empty roads alone. I shrugged it off, said I wasn't too worried, but the question stuck with me. He looked at me, and for the first time, his expression had changed. There was something cold in his eyes. He smiled, but it wasn't friendly anymore. "What would you do," he asked, "if something went wrong out here? No one around for miles, no one to help you." I laughed it off, trying to keep things light, but inside, my stomach was starting to twist. I didn't like where the conversation was going. I told him I hadn't really thought about it and that I figured I'd be fine. He leaned back in his seat, still smiling, and said, "You'd be surprised what can happen out here." I tried to steer the conversation back to safer topics, asking him where he was from, but he didn't answer. Instead, he started talking about how easy it would be for someone to disappear on these roads. He mentioned stories he'd heard about people who went missing, never found. He said sometimes, no one even looked for them. The way he was talking, it didn't feel like he was telling a story. It felt like he was making a point. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I realized I'd started speeding up without noticing. The highway stretched out in front of us, empty, and I wished more than anything I could see another car in my rearview mirror, but there was nothing. He asked me if I'd ever thought about how easy it would be to get away with something out here. "No cameras, no cops," he said, like he was thinking out loud. "Just you and me." I didn't answer. My throat felt tight, and I was starting to regret picking him up. He shifted in his seat, turning toward me more, and I could feel his eyes on me even though I didn't look at him. "You know," he said slowly, "I've been in cars with people who didn't make it to their destination." That sent a chill down my spine. I tried to keep calm, but my mind was racing, trying to figure out what I could do. We were in the middle of nowhere. No cell service. No one around. Just me and this guy who was starting to sound more and more like someone I didn't want to be alone with. I told him I needed to stop for gas soon, hoping that maybe if I pulled over, I could get away from him, make up an excuse to leave. But he didn't seem to care. He just stared at me, his smile growing wider. "You ever thought about how you defend yourself?" he asked. "Out here, if something happened?" I glanced at him, trying to keep my voice steady. "Not really," I said, trying to sound casual. "Never had a reason to." He leaned forward, closer to me. "You should think about it," he whispered, his tone dark. "Because sometimes, bad things happen when you least expect it." That was it. I couldn't take it anymore. I told him I needed to pull over to check something under the hood, my voice shaking a little. I pulled off the road, gravel crunching under the tires as I came to a stop. My heart was pounding in my chest as I threw the car into park. I got out quickly, my mind racing. I didn't look back at him. I just walked around to the front of the car, pretending to open the hood. My hands were trembling as I tried to think of a plan. Then I heard the car door open behind me. He was getting out. I could feel him walking around the car, slow, deliberate. I didn't know what he was going to do, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I bolted, running down the side of the highway as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I just ran, my feet pounding against the pavement, my breath coming in short gasps. I heard him shout after me, but I didn't stop. I kept running until I couldn't hear him anymore. Eventually, I spotted a car coming down the road in the distance, and I waved it down. The driver, a woman, stopped and let me in, her eyes wide with concern as I breathlessly explained what happened. We drove away quickly, leaving the hitchhiker behind. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I had been feeling overwhelmed by everything: work, the constant notifications on my phone, emails, social media. It was all too much. So, I decided to rent this small, off-the-grid cabin in the middle of nowhere. No internet, no cell signal, just me and the quiet. It sounded like the perfect escape. The rental website said it was secluded and ideal for those looking to disconnect, and that's exactly what I needed. I drove up there late in the afternoon, following a long, winding dirt road deep into the woods. The cabin was small, just one room with a bed, a tiny kitchen, and a fireplace. There was a small porch out front, overlooking the trees. It felt peaceful, isolated. I unpacked a few things, lit a fire, and settled in for the night, feeling like I had finally escaped the noise of the world. As the sun set, the forest got dark fast. There were no streetlights, just the glow from my lantern and the faint flicker of the fire. I was reading a book, enjoying the quiet, when I first heard it. A rustling outside, like leaves being stepped on. I figured it was just an animal, a raccoon or maybe a deer. It's the woods, after all. I tried not to think too much of it. But the sound kept going. Not the random scurrying of an animal, but something more deliberate, like footsteps. I put my book down and listened, the hair on the back of my neck starting to stand up. I walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I didn't see anything. Just shadows and trees. Then, movement. There was someone out there. Just beyond the tree line, half hidden in the shadows, I saw him. A man. He was standing perfectly still, watching the cabin. I couldn't make out his face, but I could see the shape of him, just standing there. My heart started pounding in my chest. Why would someone be out here? I hadn't seen a single person since I arrived, and the cabin was miles from the nearest town. I quickly closed the curtains and backed away from the window. I felt trapped, like there was nowhere to go. It was just me and this stranger in the woods. I thought about calling for help, but then I remembered, no phone, no internet. I was completely cut off. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it was probably just some local guy, maybe a hunter who got lost. But why was he just standing there? Why hadn't he come up to the cabin or said anything? I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The footsteps started again, closer this time. I could hear them circling the cabin, slow and deliberate. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the fireplace, gripping it tight in my hand. I didn't know what else to do. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent. Then, a tapping on the window. It was soft at first, just a light tap, tap, tap. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing up. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I wanted to look, to see if he was still there, but I was too afraid. I stayed where I was, clutching the fire poker, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. I jumped, backing away from the door. He was trying to get inside. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I could hear him breathing now, just on the other side of the door, heavy and slow. I didn't know what to do. There was no one around to help me, no way to call for help. I stood there, staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open. But it never did. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. The footsteps moved away from the door, back around the cabin. I heard him walking around outside again, pacing. Watching. I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed awake, sitting by the fire with the poker in my hands, jumping at every little sound. Every rustle of leaves, every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I kept thinking about that man, wondering if he was still out there, hiding in the trees, waiting for me to let my guard down. When the sun finally came up, I felt a little bit safer, though not much. I peeked out the window, but there was no sign of him. Just the trees, quiet and still. I quickly packed my things, not wanting to stay another minute in that cabin. I was about to leave when I saw them. Footprints. Muddy footprints leading from the woods right up to the cabin door. They circled the cabin over and over again. My stomach turned. I hadn't imagined it. He had been there, walking around the cabin all night long. I threw my stuff into the car and got out of there as fast as I could. As I drove down the dirt road, my hands were shaking. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him standing in the road behind me, watching me leave. I don't know who that man was, or why he was there, but I never wanted to find out. All I know is that I'm never going back to that cabin. I was taking the last bus of the night, the only one still running at that hour. It was around 11:30 p.m., and the streets were quiet, almost too quiet. I'd just gotten off a late shift at work, and all I wanted was to get home, shower, and fall asleep. The bus was empty when I got on, which was normal for this time of night. I sat near the middle, where I usually do, headphones in, zoning out. The first couple of stops passed by, and no one else got on. I felt this strange sense of peace, like I had the whole bus to myself. The hum of the engine and the city lights flickering by were oddly comforting. I leaned back, trying to relax. But then, at the next stop, the bus doors hissed open, and a man got on. I didn't think much of it at first. He was wearing a long coat, and he moved slow, almost like he was in no rush. He could have sat anywhere, there were plenty of open seats. But instead, he walked straight down the aisle and sat right behind me. Out of all the empty spots, he chose the one directly behind mine. It made my skin crawl, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Maybe he just liked sitting there. I stayed still, staring at my phone, pretending to scroll through music. That's when I heard it. A whisper. So quiet, I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it at first. But then I heard it again, a soft, raspy voice, coming from right behind me. "You shouldn't be here," the voice whispered. I froze. The hairs on my neck stood up. I pulled out one of my headphones, but I didn't turn around. I thought maybe he was talking to himself. People do that sometimes. But then he spoke again, louder this time, just enough for me to hear. "You're not going to make it home." My heart skipped a beat. I could feel his breath on the back of my neck, even though he was sitting a row behind me. I tried to play it off, thinking maybe he was just trying to mess with me. I slid over to the window seat, putting some space between us, but I still didn't turn around. The bus kept moving, stop after stop, but no one else was getting on. It was just me and him. I felt trapped. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I thought about moving to another seat, maybe up near the driver. But before I could, he whispered again, this time more slowly. "I know what you've done." That made my blood run cold. My mind raced, trying to figure out what he meant. I hadn't done anything. I hadn't even spoken to him. But the way he said it, like he knew something about me, something dark, made my stomach twist. I couldn't sit there any longer. I stood up quickly, grabbing my bag, and moved toward the front of the bus. I sat down near the doors, right across from the driver. I felt a little safer, but not much. The driver hadn't even looked up when I moved. I glanced back, and sure enough, the man had shifted too. He was now sitting just a few rows behind me again. It was like he was following me, always keeping the same distance. My chest tightened. I kept my eyes forward, trying to ignore the sound of his breathing, which seemed louder now. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was just weird, maybe it was all in my head. But then, he started whispering again. "I've been waiting for you." I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, trying to keep calm, and walked to the very back of the bus this time, thinking maybe if I put more space between us, he'd stop. But he followed. He didn't rush, didn't seem angry, just calmly got up and sat behind me again. Always one row behind, no matter where I went. I felt panic rising in my throat. I considered asking the driver for help, but I didn't want to cause a scene. What if it was all some creepy joke? But then I heard him whisper something that chilled me to the core. "I know where you live." I whipped around this time, finally facing him. His face was shadowed by the low light inside the bus, but his eyes, those were the only thing I could see clearly. They were wide, staring at me without blinking, almost like he was waiting for me to react. His lips curled into the faintest of smiles. I bolted. I grabbed the cord to signal a stop, not caring where we were. I just wanted to get off. The bus slowed down, and the doors opened. I practically jumped out, my heart racing. But as I stood there on the curb, watching the bus pull away, I felt the cold, hard truth settle in. The man had gotten off too. He was standing a few feet behind me, hands in his pockets, just watching. I could feel his eyes on me, burning into the back of my head. I didn't know what to do. There were no other people around, just the dark, empty streets. I tried to walk away, but my legs felt like lead. "Don't bother running," he said, his voice still soft, but somehow carrying in the quiet night. I forced myself to move, walking faster, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if he was still following, but I could hear his footsteps, slow and deliberate, keeping pace with mine. No matter how fast I walked, he didn't fall behind. Finally, I turned a corner and sprinted down the nearest alley, hoping to lose him. I ran as fast as I could, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. I reached the end of the alley and ducked into a small parking lot, hiding behind a dumpster. I crouched there, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my ears. For a few minutes, everything was silent. I didn't hear his footsteps anymore. I thought maybe I had finally lost him. But then, from the shadows at the end of the lot, I heard his voice again, closer this time. "I'm right behind you." I jumped up and ran again, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. I ran until my legs burned, until I could barely breathe. When I finally stopped, I was standing outside a small diner, its lights still on. I stumbled inside, gasping for air. The people inside looked at me like I was crazy, but I didn't care. I grabbed a seat near the counter, my back to the wall, where I could see the door. I waited, half expecting him to walk in after me. But he never did. I stayed there for hours, too afraid to leave, until the sun came up. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I've never taken the bus that late again. And I never will. I booked a red-eye flight, thinking it'd be quiet. I just wanted to sleep the whole way, get to my destination without much fuss. The airport was pretty empty when I got there, just a few people wandering around the terminal. It felt nice, like I had the place to myself. I boarded the plane, found my seat in the middle of the cabin, and settled in by the window. It was one of those smaller planes, with just 2 seats on each side. A guy took the seat next to me right before takeoff. I didn't think much of it. He was wearing a hoodie, jeans, looked normal enough, maybe a few years older than me. He smiled as he sat down, and I gave a polite nod back, hoping that would be the end of our interaction. The lights dimmed, and we were getting ready for takeoff. I put my headphones in, leaned back, and closed my eyes. It was late, and I was tired. Just as I started to drift off, I felt a tap on my arm. I opened my eyes and pulled out an earbud. "Where are you headed?" the guy asked. I hesitated, not wanting to get into a conversation. "Just visiting family," I said, hoping that would shut it down. He nodded but didn't stop. "Do you fly often?" "Sometimes," I mumbled, putting my earbud back in, but he tapped me again almost immediately. "You ever been in a crash?" That question threw me off. I stared at him for a second, unsure if he was serious. "No," I said flatly, trying to end it. He chuckled, like he thought it was a joke. "You ever wonder what it'd feel like?" I felt a chill run through me. "No, not really." "Well," he said, leaning closer, "I think about it sometimes. You know, how fast it would all happen. If you'd even feel it. I didn't know what to say. His tone wasn't playful. It was too casual, too interested in the idea. I shifted in my seat, trying to inch away from him without making it obvious. I looked around, but the cabin was dark, and everyone else seemed to be either sleeping or watching their in-flight entertainment. I put my earbuds back in, louder this time, hoping he'd get the message. For a few minutes, he stayed quiet, and I thought that was the end of it. But then, I felt him tap me again, harder this time. I took out my earbuds, annoyed. "What? Do you ever think about what people are really like?" he asked, his voice low, like he was sharing a secret. Like, what they're hiding. I stared at him, not sure what he was getting at. "What do you mean?" He leaned even closer, so close I could smell his breath. "Everyone's got something, right? A secret. Something dark." His eyes were wide, staring at me like he was waiting for me to agree. "What do you think people hide from the world?" I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing at the flight attendant who was busy at the front of the plane. I thought about asking to switch seats, but I didn't want to make a scene. "I don't know," I muttered, trying to turn away. "I bet you've got something," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Everyone does. Something you don't want anyone to know." I felt my stomach turn. "Can you stop?" I asked, my voice shaky. He smiled, a slow, creepy smile that made my skin crawl. "What are you afraid of?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was racing, and I felt trapped, boxed in against the window. I pressed the call button for the flight attendant, praying she'd come quickly. I needed to get away from him. The flight attendant came over after what felt like forever. I asked if I could switch seats, told her I wasn't feeling well and needed some space. She looked around the cabin and gave me an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, but the flight is full," she said quietly. "There's nowhere to move you." My heart sank. I nodded, trying to keep calm, but as soon as she walked away, I felt his eyes on me again. "You tried to leave," he whispered. "Why would you do that?" I didn't answer, just stared straight ahead, trying to focus on anything but him. My hands were trembling, and I was gripping the armrest so hard my knuckles were white. He kept going, his voice barely audible, but I could hear every word. "You think they'll protect you? There's no one here but us." I squeezed my eyes shut, willing myself to ignore him. I thought about calling the flight attendant again, but I was too scared to move, scared he'd get angry if I did. The plane was dark, and the hum of the engine was the only sound, but all I could focus on was his breathing, his presence looming next to me. For the next few hours, I barely moved. Every time I shifted, I could feel him watching me, like he was waiting for me to react, to show him I was afraid. I could sense his eyes on me, even though I didn't dare look at him. The flight felt like it was never going to end. Every minute dragged on, and I felt trapped, like there was no escape. I kept my head down, focused on my breathing, trying to convince myself that I'd be okay, that nothing was going to happen. When we finally started descending, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. I could see the lights of the city below, and I knew we'd be landing soon. I just had to get through the next few minutes. But then, as we were about to land, he leaned in one last time. His breath was warm against my ear. "I know where you're going," he whispered. I couldn't respond. I couldn't even move. When the plane finally landed, I grabbed my bag and practically ran off, not caring if I looked panicked. I didn't look back to see if he followed. I just kept moving, straight out of the airport, into a cab, and away from there as fast as I could. I never saw him again, but I haven't flown since. And I don't think I ever will. I had been feeling worn out from work, so I booked a weekend stay at this small, remote farm upstate. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind. No noise, no people, just me and the quiet. The farmhouse was old but cozy, and the farmer who rented it out, Craig, seemed friendly enough when I arrived. He showed me around, explained a bit about the history of the place, and then left me to settle in. The first day was uneventful. I spent most of it walking around the fields, sitting by the pond, just soaking in the peace. That night, I made a small fire outside and stared up at the stars for what felt like hours. It was pitch black out there, no streetlights, no passing cars, just pure, quiet darkness. I went to bed feeling relaxed, like I'd made the right choice coming here. The second day, I barely saw Greg. I figured he was off doing farm work, so I just did my own thing again. Around dusk, I noticed him walking back from one of the fields, and he waved me over. When I got close, he looked different. His easygoing attitude from the day before was gone. His smile was tight, forced. I asked him if everything was all right, and he just nodded, said it was nothing, that I should head inside soon. Later that evening, I was getting ready to turn in when I heard the sound of a lock clicking. I went to check and found that the front door was bolted from the outside. I tried the back door, same thing. Panic set in, and I knocked on the windows, calling out for Greg. He didn't answer right away, but eventually, I heard him walking up to the house. I locked up for the night, he said from outside, his voice muffled through the door. Why? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. I thought I was supposed to be able to come and go as I please. It's for your safety, he replied, his tone flat. You don't want to be outside after dark around here. I asked him what he meant, but he just repeated that it was for my safety and walked away before I could ask anything else. I stood there, confused, listening to his footsteps fade into the distance. The farm was silent, the kind of silence that felt unnatural, heavy. I went to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises, scratches, soft thuds, like something was moving around outside. At first, I thought maybe it was just animals, but the more I listened, the more it started to sound like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps, circling the house. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, my heart racing. I kept thinking about Greg's face earlier that evening, the way his smile had seemed wrong, forced. Something wasn't right here. But there was nothing I could do. The doors were locked, and the windows were too small to climb out of. I was trapped. Hours passed, and the noises outside didn't stop. At one point, I heard a low, guttural sound, like something was growling. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard before, but it was close. Really close. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, listening, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did, at least not until early morning when the first light started creeping through the curtains. That's when the noises finally stopped. The farm felt still again, but the tension in the air was thick, like something had changed. When Greg unlocked the doors that morning, he acted like nothing had happened. He smiled, asked if I slept well, even offered me some breakfast. I asked him about the noises, and he just shrugged, said it was probably the wind or some coyotes. But I didn't believe him. There was something he wasn't telling me, something he was hiding. I tried to keep things normal, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. Craig watched me more closely that day, his eyes following me wherever I went, like he was waiting for me to ask more questions. I wanted to, but every time I tried, he'd just give me that same tight smile and change the subject. That night, just before dark, I heard the lock click again. I rushed to the door, but it was too late. Craig had already bolted it from the outside. I shouted for him, demanded he let me out, but he didn't respond. I pounded on the door until my fists hurt, but he didn't come back. I was locked in again. The noises started earlier this time. As soon as the sun disappeared, I heard them footsteps, slow and steady, moving around the house. I sat in the middle of the living room, clutching a kitchen knife I'd grabbed earlier, my eyes darting to every window, every shadow. And then, the growling came back. This time, it was louder, more distinct. It wasn't an animal, it couldn't be. The sound was too human. Like someone was trying to mimic the sound of an animal, but failing. I heard something scrape against the wall outside, right next to the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would explode. I could see the shadow of someone outside, pacing back and forth. Suddenly, the handle on the back door rattled. I jumped up, gripping the knife tighter. The rattling stopped for a moment, then started again, harder this time, like someone was trying to force the door open. I backed up, my eyes locked on the door, praying it would hold. After what felt like an eternity, the rattling stopped. But the footsteps didn't. They moved to the front of the house, then back to the side, like whoever or whatever was out there was trying to find a way in. I don't know how long it went on. It felt like hours, but eventually, the noises faded, and everything went quiet again. I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to sleep, waiting for Greg to come back. When he unlocked the doors the next morning, I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my stuff and told him I was leaving. He didn't argue. He didn't try to stop me. He just smiled that same tight smile and said, "You'll be safer if you leave now." I drove away from that farm as fast as I could, and I haven't looked back since. I don't know what was out there, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something was wrong with that place, with Craig, and I'm never going back. I decided to extend my beach vacation for a few more days. It was supposed to be a relaxing retreat. The kind of place where you could hear the waves crashing and nothing else. The resort was right on the beach, and I had spent most of my days lounging in the sun and swimming. One evening, I felt like staying out a bit longer, so I took a walk along the shoreline after sunset. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and the sky was turning dark. The beach was empty. The resort lights flickered on in the distance, but I was far enough down the beach that I could barely see them. The only sounds were the waves and the distant cry of seagulls. I felt a sense of peace, like I had the whole place to myself. I wandered up and down the beach, enjoying the quiet. The sand was cool under my feet, and the air was crisp. It felt great to be away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. I walked further from the resort, heading towards the dunes. It was a beautiful night, but it was also eerily quiet. I noticed that I hadn't seen anyone for a while, which was unusual for a popular beach area. As I reached the dunes, I noticed a group of men coming out from behind them. They seemed to appear out of nowhere, and there were 5 or 6 of them. They were dressed in casual clothes, but their behavior was anything but relaxed. They were talking among themselves, laughing loudly, but their voices were tinged with something I couldn't quite place. I started to feel uneasy. I was alone, and the beach was deserted except for this group. I turned to head back toward the resort, but I realized the men were moving in the same direction. They hadn't seen me yet, but I could tell they were heading my way. My heart started to race. I tried to stay calm and keep a steady pace, but every time I looked back, they were closer. They hadn't noticed me specifically, but their path was directly towards where I was walking. I quickened my pace, trying to make it back to the resort before they reached me. The sand felt like it was dragging my feet down. I started to think about my options. There weren't any other people around, and I had no way of calling for help. My phone was back at the resort, and I didn't want to risk going back there alone. I decided to take a different route, hoping to lose them among the dunes. I ducked behind a sand dune, trying to hide, and watched as they got closer. From my hiding spot, I saw them looking around, scanning the area. I could hear their voices clearly now. They were talking about finding someone, and it sounded like they were getting frustrated. I could see the shadows of their figures moving, and I had to stay as still and as quiet as possible. They were moving in my direction, so I carefully crawled further away from them, trying to stay out of sight. My heart was pounding, and my breathing felt loud in my ears. I could barely see the resort lights in the distance now. The thought of being trapped out here with these men was terrifying. I kept moving, inching along the dunes, hoping to find a place to escape. The men seemed to be closing in on my location. I heard one of them say something about checking further up the beach. They were getting closer, and I had to act fast. When I felt that they were far enough away, I made a break for it, heading towards the resort as quickly as I could. The sand was difficult to run on, but I pushed myself to keep going. I could still hear their voices in the distance, but they seemed to be fading. As I neared the resort, I saw the lights more clearly and felt a surge of relief. I ran to the main entrance, my heart still racing. The security guard at the gate looked at me with concern, but I didn't stop to explain. I just rushed inside the building, locking the door behind me. I stayed in my room that night, too scared to go out again. I didn't see the men again, and I made sure to stay close to the resort for the rest of my stay. I didn't want to think about what might have happened if I hadn't managed to get away. The beach, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt dangerous and threatening. I left the resort a day early, eager to put that night behind me. I work as a food delivery driver, and one evening, I got a delivery to a house in a quiet neighborhood. It was a routine job, or so I thought. The address was for a large, single-family home that looked like it had been recently painted. The lights were on, and I could see some movement through the windows as I pulled up, but when I rang the doorbell, no one answered. I waited for a few minutes, thinking maybe they were just slow to answer. I checked the order details to make sure I had the right house, and it all seemed correct. The app showed the order was for delivery, and the address matched. Just as I was about to call the number listed, I received a text message from the customer. The message instructed me to leave the food in the backyard. The tone was polite, but it struck me as odd. It was a bit unconventional, but I followed the instructions. I went around the side of the house and found a gate leading to the backyard. It was locked, but there was a small latch I managed to lift to get through. The backyard was well kept with a neatly trimmed lawn and some patio furniture. It looked like a nice place. I placed the food on the patio table as instructed. As I turned to leave, I noticed the gate was shut and then heard a loud click. I quickly realized the latch had been locked from the outside. My heart sank as I tried to lift the latch, but it wouldn't budge. I was locked in. I felt a surge of panic. I tried calling the customer, but there was no answer. I was completely alone in the backyard, and there were no other houses close enough for me to call out for help. The street was quiet, and the house was isolated. I tried climbing over the fence, but it was too high and the metal was sharp. I walked around the yard, looking for another way out. There was a shed in the corner, but it was locked tight. I noticed a small window on the side of the house. It was high up, but I considered it as a possible escape route. I grabbed a chair from the patio, hoping I could reach the window, but I couldn't quite make it. My anxiety grew with every passing minute. I could hear my own breathing and the occasional rustle of the wind in the trees. The silence was deafening. I tried calling the customer again, but it went straight to voicemail. I thought about trying to break the window, but that would only attract attention and make things worse. Then, I heard footsteps approaching. My heart raced as I saw a figure walking around the side of the house. I called out, but the figure didn't respond. It was a man, and he looked like he was inspecting the backyard. When he saw me, he stopped and seemed surprised. He walked over to the gate and unlocked it. I was relieved but also scared. The man didn't say anything. He just opened the gate and walked away. I quickly grabbed the food and left the backyard, rushing back to my car. I didn't stop to ask questions or look back. I just drove away, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. Later, I thought about reporting the incident, but I didn't have much information. The customer's number was out of service, and the address seemed normal otherwise. I was just glad to have gotten out safely. It was one of the scariest moments I've ever experienced while on the job. From that day on, I've been extra cautious with deliveries, always making sure to follow up if something seems off. I decided to go for a run in the park early one morning. It was my usual routine. I liked the solitude and the fresh air, and the park was always quiet at that hour. I started my run at a comfortable pace, enjoying the cool breeze and the sound of my feet hitting the path. Everything was normal until I noticed two men jogging behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. The park was a public place, and people ran all the time. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw that the men were not only running behind me but also keeping a steady pace. I increased my speed, thinking I'd put some distance between us. They matched my speed almost immediately. My heart began to race. I tried to keep my pace steady, but the men stayed right behind me, never falling back. Every time I sped up, they did too. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to change my route, hoping that a different path might shake them off. I turned onto a side trail, one that was less traveled and winding. I was hopeful that this would help. But as I reached the end of the trail and turned back onto the main path, the men were still there. They had cut across the open field to stay on my trail. I felt panic starting to set in. I tried to stay calm and think clearly. I could see a park ranger's booth up ahead, so I decided to head in that direction. Maybe if I reached the ranger, they would be able to help. I glanced back and saw the men picking up their pace. They were gaining on me. I pushed myself harder, but it was clear they were determined to keep up. When I reached the ranger's booth, it was empty. No one was there. I felt a lump in my throat and started looking for another exit. I noticed a small, wooded area nearby and darted towards it, hoping the trees would hide me. I ran as fast as I could, zigzagging through the trees. The men were no longer in sight, but I could still hear their footsteps crunching through the underbrush. I found a spot behind a thick tree and crouched down, trying to catch my breath and calm my racing heart. I waited there for what felt like an eternity, listening carefully for any sign of their presence. I could still hear rustling, but it seemed to be moving away. After a while, I slowly made my way back towards the park entrance, keeping to the shadows and avoiding any open areas. I didn't see the men again. When I finally reached the main road, I flagged down a passing car and asked the driver to call the police for me. The police arrived quickly and took a report. I told them everything that had happened. They said they would check the park, but I never found out if they were able to locate the men. I was too shaken up to stick around and wait. The whole experience left me terrified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something really bad could have happened if I hadn't managed to get away. I took a break from running in the park for a while after that and always made sure to have someone with me or to stay in more populated areas. I rented a boat to spend a peaceful day on the lake. It was a serene morning, and the water was calm. I was looking forward to a day of fishing in solitude. I set out around 8 a.m., with a cooler full of snacks and my fishing gear. The sun was shining, and everything felt perfect. The lake was quiet. I anchored the boat in a secluded spot where I could cast out and relax. I spent the first few hours fishing, enjoying the tranquility. I hadn't seen another boat all day, which was just the way I liked it. Around 6 p.m., as the sun began to set, I noticed another boat approaching. It was a small, speedboat, and it seemed to be coming directly towards me. There were 3 people on board, a man, a woman, and another man. They were all waving and smiling. I thought they might be lost or just looking for a friendly chat. When they pulled up alongside my boat, they introduced themselves. They seemed friendly enough and asked if I was having a good day. I said I was and offered them some snacks, but they declined. The man then asked if I wanted to join them for a drink. I was hesitant but agreed, thinking it would be nice to socialize a bit. The woman helped me climb over into their boat. As soon as I was on board, I noticed that their boat was much larger and more luxurious than mine. They offered me a drink, which I accepted. The conversation started off light and casual, but I began to feel uneasy when they started asking more personal questions. I tried to steer the conversation back to neutral topics, but they kept probing. They asked where I lived, what I did for work, and if I was alone. Their questions seemed more invasive with every minute. I noticed that the sun had almost set, and it was getting dark. I started feeling uncomfortable and decided it was time to head back to my boat. I thanked them for their hospitality and said I needed to get going. That's when things took a turn. The man who had been quiet suddenly stood up and said, "Why don't you stay a bit longer? It's getting dark, and the water can be dangerous." I tried to insist on leaving, but the woman moved closer and said, we're not in a hurry. It's best if you stay with us." I could feel the change in their demeanor. The atmosphere had become tense, and I realized they were not as friendly as they seemed. I looked at my boat, now a good distance away. I tried to make my way back, but the other two men blocked the path. They exchanged glances and seemed to be silently communicating. I felt a cold sweat on my forehead. I tried to remain calm, thinking of a way to get back to my boat. I said I had an important call to make and needed to use my phone. One of the men handed me his phone. I pretended to make a call while quietly trying to think of a plan. As I was on the phone, I subtly reached for the small emergency whistle I had with me, which I kept in a pocket of my jacket. I gave it a quick blow, hoping someone might hear it. The men seemed to notice, but they didn't react immediately. I started to make my way back to the edge of their boat. I told them I needed to use the restroom. The man who had been quiet followed me, making sure I didn't stray too far. I used the opportunity to grab the rope that was tied to my boat and started to untie it. As I finished, I noticed the other two men looking at me with growing suspicion. I made a break for my boat, and as I climbed over, I could hear them shouting. I quickly started the engine and began to move away from their boat. They followed for a short distance, but as I gained speed, they eventually stopped chasing me. I could still see their boat in the distance as I made my way back to the dock. I was shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached the dock, I told the staff what had happened. They called the authorities, and the police were able to investigate the area. I stayed at the dock until they gave me the all-clear. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. I was grateful to be safe and vowed to be more cautious in the future. I realized how quickly a peaceful day on the lake could turn into a nightmare. It was pouring rain that night, the kind of rain that makes it hard to see even with the wipers on full speed. I was driving back home from my mom's place with my daughter, Lily, in the back seat. The road was slick, and the wind was howling through the trees lining the narrow road. We were about 10 miles from home when the car suddenly skidded. I tried to correct the steering, but it was too late. The car slid off the road and into a ditch, sinking into the mud with a sickening thud. Lily was scared but unhurt, thank God. I tried to drive out, but the tires just spun in the mud. I reached for my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I told Lily to stay in the car while I checked if there was any way to get the car moving. As I stepped out, the rain drenched me instantly. The mud was thick and sticky, clinging to my shoes with every step. I was inspecting the tires when I saw headlights approaching. A wave of relief washed over me. Maybe they could help pull us out. The car stopped, and a man stepped out. He was tall and had a hood pulled over his head, making it hard to see his face. "Need some help?" he called out over the sound of the rain. "Yes, please," I replied. "My car's stuck in the mud. Can you help us?" He walked over, and as he got closer, I felt a strange sense of unease. There was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. But I was desperate. "I have a rope in my truck," he said. "I can pull you out." He went back to his truck, and I turned to check on Lily. She was watching from the back seat, her wide eyes filled with worry. I tried to smile reassuringly, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The man came back with a rope and started attaching it to the front of my car. He worked in silence, his movements quick and precise. Once he was done, he got back into his truck and started pulling. The car lurched forward, but it didn't budge much. The mud was too deep. He got out of the truck again and walked over. "It's not working," he said, his tone flat. "We'll need to try something else." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He walked closer, and I noticed a glint in his eyes that sent a chill down my spine. "Why don't you and the kid come wait in my truck? It's warm and dry." Something about his suggestion set off alarm bells in my head. "No, we're fine," I said quickly. "We'll stay here." His expression darkened. "It's not safe out here," he insisted, stepping closer. "You need to come with me." I took a step back, my heart pounding. No, thank you, I repeated, trying to keep my voice steady. We'll be fine. He grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. I'm not asking, he crawled. You're coming with me. Panic surged through me. I twisted out of his grip and ran to the car, locking the doors behind me. Lily was crying, and I tried to calm her down while fumbling for my phone. Still no signal. The man was pounding on the window now, shouting for me to open the door. I ignored him and started the car, hoping against hope that we could somehow get free. The tires spun uselessly, and I felt tears of frustration and fear welling up. Then, a miracle. Another set of headlights appeared down the road. The man stopped pounding and turned to face the new car. I honked the horn desperately, hoping to get their attention. The car stopped, and two men got out. They looked from me to the man and seemed to understand the situation immediately. Is there a problem here? One of them called out. The man backed away from the window, muttering something under his breath. He glanced at me one last time, his eyes full of anger, before walking back to his truck. He drove off without another word. The two men walked over to my car. Are you okay? One of them asked. I nodded, still shaken. Yes, thank you. He was trying to get us to go with him. They looked at each other and then back at me. Let's get you out of here, the other man said. They hooked up their truck to my car and managed to pull it free from the mud. Once we were back on the road, I thanked them repeatedly. They offered to follow us home to make sure we got there safely, and I gratefully accepted. Lily was still scared, but I promised her we were safe now. We made it home without any further incidents. I never found out who that man was or what he wanted, but I'm grateful to those two men who showed up when they did. I don't like to think about what could have happened if they hadn't. I decided to take a weekend off and go hiking alone in the state park. I needed some time away from the city and work. The park was huge, with miles of trails, and I knew it would be the perfect place to clear my head. I packed my backpack, loaded my car, and drove out early on Saturday morning. The weather was perfect, cool and sunny. I parked my car at the trailhead, shouldered my pack, and started my hike. The first few hours were great. I enjoyed the sounds of nature, the smell of the trees, and the feeling of being alone in the wilderness. I didn't see many other hikers, which was exactly what I wanted. Around midday, I stopped to eat some lunch. I found a nice spot by a stream and sat down to rest. While I was eating, I noticed a man coming down the trail. He looked disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. He had a wild look in his eyes. As he got closer, I felt a pang of unease. Hey, there, he called out, his voice rough. You got any water? I've been lost out here for days. I hesitated, then nodded. Sure, I have some. Are you okay? He walked over and I handed him a water bottle. He drank greedily, almost finishing the whole thing. Thanks, he said, wiping his mouth. I got separated from my group a few days ago. Been wandering around trying to find my way back. I felt sorry for him, but something about his story didn't add up. He had no gear, no backpack, nothing that a hiker would have. Where did you get lost? I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Up near the ridge, he said, pointing vaguely. I've been trying to head back to the main road. I offered him some food, which he took eagerly. As he ate, I noticed he kept glancing around, almost like he was checking if anyone else was nearby. The feeling of unease grew stronger. I can show you the way back, I said. I have a map, and I know these trails pretty well. He looked at me, his eyes narrowing. That's kind of you, but I'll find my own way. Just needed a bit of rest and some water. Something in his voice made me uneasy. It's no trouble, really, I insisted. I'm heading back that way anyway. He stood up, brushing crumbs off his hands. Thanks for the offer, but I'll be fine. He turned and started walking back the way he came, disappearing into the trees. I watched him go, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something off about him. I decided to pack up and head back, feeling uneasy about staying out there alone. I put out my fire, shouldered my pack, and started down the trail. About an hour later, I heard rustling in the bushes ahead. I stopped, my heart pounding, and saw the same man step out onto the trail. He looked surprised to see me. "Oh, it's you again," he said, his voice flat. "Yeah," I said, trying to sound casual. "Heading back to my car." He nodded, but his eyes were cold. "Be careful out here. You never know who you might run into." I nodded and walked past him, my skin crawling. As I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. I had the feeling he was following me, but every time I looked back, I saw nothing. The sun was starting to set, and I knew I needed to get back to my car before dark. I quickened my pace, my heart racing. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me jump. I felt like I was being watched, hunted. I pushed myself to keep moving, not daring to stop. Finally, I saw the parking lot through the trees. Relief washed over me. I jogged the last few yards to my car, fumbling for my keys. As I unlocked the door, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw the man emerging from the trees, his face twisted in anger. "You shouldn't have come back here," he growled, his voice low and menacing. I jumped into my car and locked the doors. He banged on the window, shouting. I started the engine and floored it, gravel spraying as I sped out of the parking lot. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw him standing there, watching me with a look of pure rage. I drove straight to the ranger station and told them everything. They took me seriously, sending out a search team. Later, I found out that the man was a fugitive, hiding out in the park to avoid capture. He had been on the run for weeks, and I had stumbled right into his hiding place. The rangers found his campsite and some of his belongings, but he was gone. I was lucky to get out when I did. The experience left me shaken, and I haven't been back to that park since. Now, I'm always cautious when hiking alone, always aware of the possibility of danger lurking just out of sight. It was pouring rain when I left the office that night. The storm had been building all day, and now it was a full-blown downpour. I hurried to my car, huddling under my umbrella, and saw Tom standing at the entrance. He looked soaked, even with his raincoat on. "Need a ride?" I called out. Tom smiled, relieved. "Thanks, Rachel. I appreciate it." He climbed into the passenger seat, and I cranked up the heat. We chatted about work as I navigated the slick roads. The rain was so heavy, it was hard to see beyond a few feet. The wipers were working overtime, but it barely made a difference. We came to a red light, and I glanced over at Tom. He seemed tense, his fingers drumming on his knee. "Everything okay?" I asked. He nodded, but didn't say anything. The light turned green, and I started to drive. A few blocks later, I noticed Tom wasn't in the car anymore. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard the door open or felt any movement. I pulled over, panic rising. How could he just disappear? I got out, looking around, calling his name. The rain was relentless, soaking me in seconds. There was no sign of him anywhere. I got back in the car, my mind racing. Did he jump out? Why didn't I hear anything? I decided to head back to the office, thinking maybe he had gone back there for some reason. When I arrived, the building was dark and locked up. I knocked on the door, hoping the night guard might have seen something. No answer. I was alone. I drove around the area, circling the blocks near where he vanished, but there was no sign of Tom. Feeling desperate, I called the police. They said they would send someone out to take a report, but their tone made it clear they thought he probably just decided to walk home. I sat in my car, shivering from the cold and the fear. Something was very wrong. I decided to go to Tom's apartment, hoping he might be there. When I got there, his lights were off. I banged on his door, but no one answered. As I turned to leave, a figure stepped out of the shadows. I jumped, recognizing one of Tom's neighbors. He looked at me with a mix of curiosity and concern. "You looking for Tom?" he asked. I nodded. "Have you seen him?" He shook his head. "Not since this morning." "Is something wrong?" I explained what had happened, and he looked even more worried. "Tom's been acting strange lately. He mentioned something about being followed, but I thought he was just stressed from work." The rain kept pounding down as I got back into my car. My phone rang, and I saw it was an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Rachel," a voice said. It was Tom, but he sounded scared. "Tom, where are you?" "I don't have much time." "Don't trust them," he whispered. The line went dead. My hands were shaking as I tried to call him back, but it went straight to voicemail. I had no idea what was going on, but I knew I couldn't go to the police. They wouldn't believe me. I drove around aimlessly, trying to piece together what little I knew. My thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a black car that seemed to be following me. Every turn I made, it was right there behind me. Panic set in. I took a sharp turn down a side street and sped up, hoping to lose them. My heart was pounding as I navigated the narrow, rain-slicked roads. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the car still behind me. I drove towards the outskirts of town, hoping the winding roads would help me shake them. The car was relentless, though, staying on my tail. I saw a narrow dirt road and turned onto it, the car bouncing over the rough terrain. The road led into a dense forest. The trees closed in around me, and the headlights of the car behind me disappeared. I kept driving until I found a small clearing, then turned off my engine and lights, hoping they wouldn't find me. I sat there in the dark, the rain hammering on the roof, trying to calm my racing heart. I had to figure out what was happening and why Tom had disappeared. I couldn't go home, it wasn't safe. After what felt like hours, the rain finally started to let up. I decided to head back to town, keeping to the back roads. I needed answers, and the only place I could think of was Tom's apartment. When I arrived, the building was dark and quiet. I snuck in through a side door that I knew was always left unlocked. I crept up to Tom's apartment and picked the lock, a skill I had learned years ago and never thought I'd need. Inside, the place was a mess. Papers were scattered everywhere, and it looked like someone had been searching for something. I found Tom's laptop on the table and opened it, hoping for a clue. As I searched through his files, I found a folder marked Danger. Inside were documents and photos detailing some kind of conspiracy. There were pictures of people I recognized from around town, notes about meetings, and lists of names. It was all connected to some illegal activities that Tom had uncovered. Suddenly, I heard footsteps outside the door. I quickly closed the laptop and hid behind the couch. The door creaked open, and I saw a pair of boots step inside. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. The person moved around the apartment, searching through the mess. After what felt like an eternity, they left, and I heard the door lock behind them. I waited a few minutes before coming out of my hiding spot. I grabbed Tom's laptop and slipped out of the apartment, heading back to my car. I needed to find a safe place to go through the files and figure out who I could trust. I drove to a nearby motel and checked in under a fake name. In the safety of my room, I opened the laptop again and went through everything. It was clear that Tom had stumbled onto something big, and now we were both targets. I knew I had to get this information to someone who could help, but I had to be careful. I spent the rest of the night making copies of the files and sending them to trusted contacts, hoping they would take it seriously. As dawn approached, I felt a little safer. The storm had passed, but I knew the danger wasn't over. I had to stay hidden until I could be sure the information was out and Tom was safe. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and fear. I moved from place to place, never staying in one spot for too long. I heard from one of my contacts that the information had been leaked to the press, and the authorities were investigating. Finally, I got a call from Tom. He was safe, hiding out in a different city. He thanked me for helping him, and we agreed to lay low until things blew over. It took months for the dust to settle, but eventually, the people behind the conspiracy were arrested, and things started to go back to normal. I never saw Tom again, but we kept in touch through encrypted messages. That rainy night changed everything. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to always be aware of my surroundings. The memory of Tom's disappearance and the fear that followed still haunt me, but I'm grateful we both made it out alive. I went on a solo hunting trip up in the Alaskan wilderness last year. I'd done it before, but never alone. This time, I wanted the peace and quiet, just me in the woods. I planned to be out there for about a week, living off what I could catch and eating the supplies I packed. I had my rifle, a tent, some basic gear, and enough food to last me. I'd picked a spot deep in the forest, far from any towns or people. The first couple of days were fine. I set up my camp near a small river, plenty of water, and it looked like there were some good signs of game. I caught a few rabbits and even saw some deer tracks. It was cold, but I was prepared for that. I was used to the quiet, just the wind through the trees and the sound of the river nearby. But on the third day, things started to feel different. I woke up early, as usual, and went out to check the snares I had set up the day before. One of them had caught a rabbit, but the others were empty. That wasn't unusual, but what struck me as odd was that one of the snares had been tampered with. The wire was twisted in a way I hadn't left it. I thought maybe it was an animal that had tried to get the bait without getting caught, but it didn't look right. It looked like someone had messed with it. I tried to shake it off and went about my day. I went further into the woods, looking for deer or anything else I could find. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just trees and snow. Later that day, I found footprints. Human footprints. They weren't mine, and they were fresh. I'd been in that area earlier and knew I hadn't walked that way. The prints were deep, like whoever made them was carrying something heavy. They led off into the woods, away from my camp. I thought maybe it was another hunter, but I hadn't seen or heard anyone else around. I decided to follow the tracks a little ways, just to see where they went. They led deeper into the woods, twisting around trees and over rocks. Whoever it was, they knew how to move quietly. I followed them for a while, but then I heard something, a snap, like a branch breaking underfoot. I froze, listened, but didn't hear anything else. I decided it was better to head back to my camp before it got too dark. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside my tent, rustling, like something moving around in the dark. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I kept my rifle close, just in case. In the morning, I found more footprints. They were closer to my camp this time, circling around. Whoever it was, they had been watching me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was out there, following me. I started to feel scared, real scared. I wanted to leave, but I didn't want to panic. I told myself I'd pack up and head out first thing in the morning. I went to check the traps again, trying to keep my mind off it, but I found something that made my blood run cold. One of the traps had been sprung, but instead of an animal, there was a small doll, like a child's toy, hanging from the snare. It was dirty and old, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had put it there, left it for me to find. I felt my stomach turn. This wasn't a coincidence. Someone was out here, messing with me, playing some kind of sick game. I grabbed the doll and threw it away, trying to stay calm. I needed to leave, right then and there. I packed up as fast as I could and started heading back toward the trail where I'd come in. But as I walked, I kept finding more signs. More footprints, more twisted branches, like someone was trying to lead me somewhere. And then I found another doll, this one hanging from a tree by a string, swinging in the wind. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I was being hunted. I kept moving, trying not to think, just focusing on getting back to the trail. But the further I went, the more lost I felt. I didn't recognize anything. It was like the woods had changed around me, like I was being led away from the path. Then I heard a whistle. It was soft at first, almost like a bird call. But then it came again, louder, closer. I turned around, my rifle up, ready to shoot, but there was nothing. Just trees and shadows. I felt trapped, like a rabbit caught in a snare, with nowhere to go. I started running, not caring about the noise, just wanting to get away. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs burned and my lungs felt like they'd burst. But then I saw it, my camp. I had gone in a big circle, and I was back where I started. I knew then that I was in real trouble. Whoever was out there knew these woods better than I did. They were leading me around, playing with me. I didn't know what to do. I felt like a fool for coming out here alone. I tried to think, tried to come up with a plan. I could stay at my camp and wait it out, try to defend myself. Or I could keep moving, try to find my way back. I didn't know what was worse, staying put and waiting for them to come to me, or walking into another trap. I decided to move. I couldn't stay there, not knowing what was out there. I started walking again, slower this time, trying to be quiet. But every sound made me jump. Every shadow looked like a person. I felt like I was going crazy. Then, as the sun was starting to set, I saw him. A man, standing between the trees, just watching me. He was too far away to see clearly, but I could feel his eyes on me. I raised my rifle, shouting at him to go away, but he didn't move. He just stood there, like he was waiting. I fired a shot into the air, thinking it might scare him off, but he didn't even flinch. He just stood there, watching. I felt a wave of fear wash over me. I turned and ran, not caring where I was going, just wanting to get away from him. I ran until I tripped over a rock and fell, my rifle slipping out of my hand. I scrambled to get up, grabbing my rifle, and kept running. I didn't know where I was going. I just wanted to be far away from that man. Eventually, I came to a clearing and saw smoke in the distance. I ran towards it, praying it was help and not another trap. As I got closer, I saw it was a group of hikers. I ran to them, shouting for help. They looked at me like I was crazy, but they listened. They let me use their phone, and I called for help. A rescue team came and got me out of there. I told them about the man, about the traps and the dolls, but they didn't find anyone. They said I was lucky, that I could have died out there. I didn't argue. I just wanted to go home. I still think about that trip sometimes, about the man in the woods. I don't know who he was or what he wanted. Maybe he was just some crazy person, or maybe he was hunting me, like I was hunting out there. I don't know. All I know is I'll never go back. My car broke down on a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. It was dark, pitch black outside, and the only light came from the dim glow of my dashboard. The engine had just sputtered out, and no matter how many times I turned the key, it wouldn't start again. I sat there for a minute, trying to figure out what to do. No cars had passed for miles, and my phone didn't have a signal. I popped the hood, hoping it was something simple, though I had no idea what I was looking for. I stared at the engine like it might fix itself if I looked hard enough, but it was useless. The cold air bit into my skin as I stood there, the silence stretching out. There wasn't a house or gas station for miles, just endless desert on either side. After what felt like forever, I saw headlights in the distance. Relief washed over me. Maybe someone could help or at least give me a ride to the nearest town. I waved my arms as the truck approached, signaling for them to stop. To my surprise, they did. A big, beat-up truck rolled to a stop a few feet in front of my car. The engine rumbled as the driver rolled down the window. A man sat behind the wheel, the brim of his baseball cap pulled low, so I couldn't really see his face. He leaned out, squinting at me through the darkness. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice rough, like he smoked a pack a day. "Yeah," I said, stepping closer. "Won't start. I don't know what's wrong." He sat there for a moment, like he was thinking about something. Then he smiled, but there was something off about it. "I can take a look." Popped out again. I nodded and hurried back to my car. I was desperate for help, so I didn't think twice. I popped the hood and stepped aside as he got out of the truck and walked over. He didn't even glance at the engine, though. He just stood there, hands on his hips, staring down at me. "You got any money on you?" he asked, his voice different now. There was a hard edge to it. I froze, not sure if I'd heard him right. What?" "Money," he said again, more forcefully. "Wallet, phone, whatever you got." I took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't have much." "I don't care how much you got," he snapped, cutting me off. "Hand it over." I realized then that I wasn't getting help. This guy wasn't here to fix my car. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. There was no one around, no one to call for help. I was completely alone with this guy. "I don't have much cash," I said, my voice shaking. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my wallet. I didn't know what else to do. "You can take it. Just leave me alone." He snatched the wallet from my hand and rifled through it. There wasn't much in there, just a few bills and my ID, but he didn't seem satisfied. He tossed the wallet to the ground and glared at me. "What else you got?" I shook my head. "That's it, man. I don't have anything else." He stepped closer, his face inches from mine. I could smell the cigarettes on his breath, mixed with something else, something sour. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not lying," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's all I have." He stood there for a second, just staring at me. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a knife. The blade glinted in the faint light from my car's headlights. My stomach dropped. "Maybe you're hiding something," he said, waving the knife in front of me. "How about you empty your pockets and prove it?" I did what he said, pulling out my phone and keys, showing him there was nothing else. My hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped them. He snatched the phone out of my hand, glancing at the screen. "No signal," he muttered, tossing it onto the ground next to my wallet. Then he turned the knife in his hand, pointing it right at me. "You're gonna come with me. Get in the truck." My whole body went cold. "What?" "No, I said get in the truck," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Or I'll cut you right here." I had no choice. I glanced at the truck, my mind racing. If I got in, there was no telling what he'd do to me. But if I didn't... I swallowed hard and started walking toward the passenger side of the truck. Suddenly, there was a loud noise, a car coming from the distance. I turned, seeing another set of headlights approaching fast. The man cursed under his breath and shoved me hard. "Get in the damn truck," he yelled. But I didn't. The headlights were getting closer, and I made a split-second decision. I bolted, running toward the middle of the road, waving my arms frantically. The man shouted behind me, but I didn't look back. The car slowed down, and I could see it was a police cruiser. I ran straight for the car, yelling for help. The cop stepped out, hand on his holster, looking between me and the man by my car. The truck driver froze, glancing at the cruiser, then back at me. "What's going on here?" the cop asked, his eyes narrowing. Before I could say anything, the man backed away, getting into his truck. "Just a misunderstanding," he muttered, slamming the door and speeding off into the night. I stood there, panting, my heart racing as I watched his taillights disappear down the road. The cop turned to me, his hand still on his holster. "You okay?" I nodded, but I didn't feel okay. Not even close. I booked the Airbnb for a weekend getaway. It was this small, old house on the outskirts of a quiet town. Looked cozy enough in the pictures, and I just needed some time away from everything. The host, a guy named Eric, had good reviews, and the price was cheap, so I thought, why not? When I got there, it It was just as expected. Kind of rustic but clean, a bit worn down, but it had that charm, you know? Eric had left the key in a lockbox by the door, so I didn't meet him right away. I let myself in, dropped my bags, and walked around to check the place out. The living room had this old couch, a coffee table with a couple of magazines on it, and a TV that looked like it hadn't been used in years. That's when I noticed the camera. It was small, tucked into the corner of the bookshelf, almost hidden by some dusty old books. At first, I thought maybe it was part of the security system or something, but it was pointed directly at the couch, not toward the door or windows. I didn't like it. It felt off. So, I took out my phone and snapped a picture of it, just in case. Then I texted Eric to ask what it was for. He replied quickly, saying there was no camera in the house, and that maybe I was mistaken. But I knew what I saw. It was weird. His response was way too casual, like he didn't care at all, or worse, like he was trying to brush it off. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I also didn't feel comfortable. Still, I figured it wasn't worth leaving over. I'd paid for the place, and I was only staying for 2 nights. I unplugged the camera and put it in a drawer. I figured if Eric really didn't know about it, no harm done. And if he did, well, I'd made my point. But the more I thought about it, the more uneasy I got. Why would there be a hidden camera in the living room? It just didn't make sense. The day went by quietly. I walked around town, grabbed some lunch, tried to shake off the weird feeling. When I got back to the house, it was already getting dark, and the place felt different, heavier. I made myself some dinner and tried to relax, but every little noise made me jump. Around 10 p.m., I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, you know how old houses are. But then it happened again. Slow, deliberate steps coming from the hallway. I froze, listening. The footsteps were faint but definitely there, like someone walking quietly, trying not to be heard. I grabbed my phone and stood up, my heart racing. The footsteps stopped. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went to the hallway, turned on the light, and looked around. The house was empty, exactly how I'd left it. The door was locked, and all the windows were shut. Still, I didn't feel safe. I texted Eric again, telling him about the footsteps, but this time he didn't reply. I waited for a while, staring at my phone, but nothing. It was past midnight by then, and I was starting to get really freaked out. I decided to sleep with the lights on. I know it sounds stupid, but I couldn't bring myself to turn them off. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the house. And then I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were closer, coming from right outside my bedroom door. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The door was closed, but I could hear the floorboards creaking, slow, careful steps moving toward the door. I texted Eric again, asking if anyone else had access to the house, but no reply. The footsteps stopped, right outside my door. I was paralyzed, too scared to move. I didn't know what to do. Then the doorknob rattled, just for a second, like someone was testing it. I held my breath, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. But it didn't. After what felt like forever, the footsteps started again, this time moving away from the door, down the hallway, toward the living room. I stayed in bed, listening, my mind racing. Who was in the house? Why weren't they leaving? I wanted to call the police, but I couldn't find the words. What would I even say? That I heard footsteps? That I found a camera? It all felt too surreal, like I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone, my car keys, and bolted out of bed. I didn't even bother packing my things. I just needed to get out. The house was silent as I crept down the hallway, my heart pounding in my ears. The living room was empty, the camera still in the drawer where I'd left it. I unlocked the front door as quietly as I could and slipped outside. The cold night air hit me, and I ran to my car, not looking back. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was far out of town, parked at a gas station, shaking. I texted Eric again, telling him I was leaving and that something was wrong with the house. This time, he replied almost immediately. "You shouldn't have left." That was all he said.